What if the love of your life was tied to your family's darkest secret? Lily parked her bike on the narrow sidewalk and looked at the building in front of her with a confused expression. She was used to making deliveries to sophisticated addresses, but the place where she was an exaggeration of luxury. A reception with marble walls, floor-to-ceiling tempered glass windows, and a uniformed doorman gave the place an air of inaccessibility. Lily looked down at the paper in her hands, checking the address once again, as she tried to ignore the uncomfortable feeling that something was wrong. "Is it really here?" he muttered, adjusting the large cooler bag behind his back. She was tired after a long day of deliveries, but the promise of a good tip motivated her to keep going. He took a deep breath and walked in, keeping his head high as he walked past reception. "Miss, you need permission to enter," said the doorman, a man with a serious expression and an impeccable uniform. He looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and disdain, as if he couldn't understand why someone who looked so casual and unkempt, with strands of blue hair and clothes slightly stained with paint, would be in that building. "I have a delivery for a Mr. Nicholas Grant," Lily replied, forcing a smile as she tried to look confident. The doorman analyzed the name and reluctantly nodded, releasing her. She walked through the elegant lobby, feeling a little out of place, and went up to the designated floor. Upon reaching the upper floor, he found himself in front of an imposing and minimalist door. He pressed the doorbell and waited, observing his own image reflected in the mirror next to him. Before he could correct himself, the door opened, revealing a serious-looking man with a rigid posture. Nick Grant had a closed expression and a calculating look. He was dressed in impeccable attire, without any sign of disorder. The contrast between the two was stark. "Who are you?" he asked, casting a suspicious glance at the delivery bag Lily was carrying. "Lily, I'm the delivery girl. I brought the order from the vegan restaurant," she replied, trying to maintain her composure in the face of Nick's intimidating gaze. She lifted the bag with a smile she hoped was friendly, but he just frowned. "I made no request," he said coldly, with a tone of voice that made her hesitate. "Oh, no, maybe it was a mistake by the restaurant," he murmured, already preparing to apologize. However, before she could leave, Nick gave her a curious look, a mix of interest and strangeness. He looked her up and down, studying her with an unreadable expression. Lily fidgeted, unsure whether the discomfort was caused by the too formal setting or by his intense gaze, which seemed to be analyzing every detail. She was a short, lively young woman, with a sparkle in her eyes that contrasted with the harsh environment in which Nick lived. He was tall, with a rigid, almost cold posture, as if he were permanently isolated from the world around him. She felt a need to fill the uncomfortable silence. "Well, since I'm here, are you sure you don't want to take advantage of the opportunity and try it? I brought a variety of vegan dishes," she said, trying to ease the tension with a light joke, but he interrupted her with an icy look. "I don't like surprises," he replied dryly. "And besides, anything that comes from outside is unpredictable," he added with a tone of disdain. She could tell by his expression that he was being cautious, almost paranoid, about his safety. The man seemed obsessed with control and cleanliness, as if every detail of his life had to follow a rigid, unchanging order. Unable to contain her curiosity, Lily questioned him. "Do you have a problem with germs?" Nick crossed his arms and watched her with a suspicious expression. "I'm just careful," he said, his voice low and controlled, as if he were sharing a secret that no one else should know. The discomfort and contrast between the two was intense. He seemed like someone who lived trapped in a gilded cage, protected from the chaos of the world, while she carried with her a chaotic and vibrant energy, a life full of little inkblots and experiences that left marks. And in that brief encounter, she felt like she was breaking through an invisible barrier, like she was invading a space that had never been touched by anyone other than him. As he continued to watch her, something in him changed. He noticed a stain of blue ink on his hand, a stain so familiar that it transported him instantly to an ancient, vague memory. He didn't know where he knew that exact color from, but there was something comforting and disturbing at the same time. He felt a spark of curiosity, and for the first time, He looked hard at something in his own mind. Noticing that he was lost in thought, Lily decided to insist. "If you've never tried food from this type of restaurant, you're really missing out," he said, holding up the bag with an encouraging smile. His expression hardened again, as if he had been pulled back to reality. "That's not something I would do," he replied, but his voice was softer. It was as if something about her made him less defensive, even if just for a second. Lily, feeling a mixture of frustration and defiance, decided that she wouldn't leave without at least trying to convince him. "Maybe you need to step out of your comfort zone a little, you know? It's good to try new things every now and then." He looked at her with an expression that bordered on bewilderment, as if no one had ever spoken to him that way. "I don't need to be told how to live my life," he replied, with a touch of impatience. But Lily wasn't the type to give up easily. She was determined to leave an impression, however small. "Okay, but just so you know, this kind of experience can bring a little life to your world, a little color," he said, lifting the bag in one last gesture, "even if it's just to prove it." Nick watched her for a long moment before finally letting out a resigned sigh. "Okay," he said, as if giving in to something inevitable. "Leave it there, I'll try it." Surprised but pleased, Lily placed the bag carefully on a small table next to the door. "Bon appetit," I said, taking a step back as I watched him slowly close the door. The moment the door closed, she let out a relieved sigh without knowing exactly why. The interaction had been intense, more so than she expected, and something in his gaze seemed disturbingly familiar. As she left the building, Lily couldn't help but feel uneasy. She tried to understand what was so disconcerting about this man, but was unable to define exactly what made her so agitated. On the other hand, Nick remained next to the closed door for a few minutes, contemplating what had just happened. I was uncomfortable, but also intrigued, with a new feeling that I couldn't explain. It was as if Lily had left not only the food, but also a faint but disturbing mark on her world. Over the next few days, Nick tried to ignore the event, but he found himself thinking about Lily often. He didn't understand why this young woman, with such an unkempt and casual appearance, had left such a strong impression. The carefree way she had talked about leaving your comfort zone echoed in his mind. After all, she was right to some extent. Her life was a controlled sequence of events. Nick knew there were traumas in his past that contributed to his obsession with control and hygiene, but he had never reflected on how much this actually isolated him from the world. Lily, somehow, with her relaxed manner and ink stains, had planted a seed of questioning in his mind. Eventually, he decided that he needed to understand this feeling better, and perhaps, without realizing it, he began to think of a way to find Lily again. In the following days, Nick tried to focus on his routine commitments. Mornings were punctual, work schedules were precisely calculated, and his meals were meticulously organized. Still, he felt Lily's unsettling presence in his thoughts. He couldn't say exactly why, but something about her carefreeness and naturalness made him uncomfortable. The image of that ink stain on her hand, vibrant and out of context, tormented him at random moments. It was like a streak of color appearing on an immaculate canvas, a reminder that perhaps there was something more beyond the controlled world he had built for himself. One Saturday morning, while going through some reports in his office, Nick was interrupted by a strange, empty feeling that he couldn't ignore. The decision came abruptly, an impulse that did not seem to match his methodical and calculating manner. Before he knew it, he took out his cell phone and contacted the restaurant where he had placed the order. In a direct and authoritative tone, he demanded that they give him the number of the delivery girl who had shown up at his door. After some insistence and a brief explanation about a possible pending in the order, the restaurant manager agreed to send Lily's contact details. When he finally had her number in hand, he hesitated. He felt ridiculous about it. After all, he was a practical, successful man who did not allow himself to be carried away by impulses. But there was something about that young woman that disturbed his peace, and perhaps a part of him longed to find out what it was. After reflecting for a few moments, he typed a brief and objective message without any additional cordiality. "Lily, this is Nicholas Grant. I need to discuss a proposal with you. If you're interested, "Meet me in the lobby of the building where we made the delivery." As soon as he sent the message, Nick felt a pang of anxiety that surprised him. For a few minutes, he stared at his cell phone, waiting for an answer, trying to convince himself that his curiosity was purely a matter of behavioral study. Perhaps, he reasoned, she could help him better understand why certain people didn't follow strict standards. Perhaps, he thought, her presence could challenge his own aversion to chaos, forcing him to face his fears in a practical way. Whatever the reasons, it all seemed more complex than he wanted to admit. Across town, Lily was in a coffee shop when she saw the message. Nick Grant's name caused an immediate reaction, a mixture of surprise and doubt. Why would he call her? The memory of the previous delivery made her smile. He was the kind of person who exuded an intimidating coldness, and she knew that in his eyes she must seem like a clumsy, out-of-place intruder. But the proposal intrigued him. If he wanted to discuss something, it would certainly be something important. And the opportunity to earn some extra money didn't go unnoticed. In the last few months, since her mother's death, the bills had been piling up, and Lily needed any chance she could get. Minutes later, Lily replied, "Okay, I'll be there in 30 minutes." She finished her coffee and headed towards the building. The path was enough for his mind to wander to uncertain thoughts about what he might want. When she reached the lobby, she found Nick sitting in the corner, his posture impeccable, watching her as she approached. He stood up slowly, maintaining that impenetrable gaze that made her feel somewhat uncomfortable. She walked up to him, trying to appear unconcerned, but something about the man challenged her, as if there was an invisible wall around him that she couldn't cross. He greeted her with a curt nod and indicated a chair at the table opposite. Without wasting time on formalities, Nick got straight to the point. "I know our first meeting wasn't exactly usual," he began, his tone cold, but filled with a curiosity that he tried to hide. "But I have a proposal for you, something out of the ordinary." Lily looked at him with a mix of interest and caution. "I was used to strange people, but his intensity was something different." "Okay, but what exactly do you want from me?" he asked, keeping his tone light but at the same time defensive. Nick hesitated for a moment before responding. He knew what he was about to propose was unusual and possibly even disconcerting. "I want you to help me deal with the unexpected, with what's outside my comfort zone. You seem like someone who thrives on chaos," he said, choosing his words precisely. "And I'm not. I live a structured routine, and recently I realized that maybe it's isolating me." Lily raised her eyebrows in surprise. "I would never have imagined that someone like Nick Grant, with all his rigidity and control, would seek help for something so simple and, at the same time, so essential. So, you want me to teach you how to deal with things that don't follow your order?" "In essence, yes," he replied, keeping his tone serious. "I'm willing to compensate you financially for this. I know it's an unusual task, but I believe you can help." She pondered for a moment. It was a strange proposition, but the payment he offered was tempting, and deep down, she was curious. There was something about this man that seemed locked away, hidden behind a facade of perfection. Plus, it was a chance to do something different, maybe even fun. "Okay, but how do you think I can help you? I mean, what are your expectations on this?" He seemed to consider the question for a moment. "I want you to show me how to deal with situations that are out of my control," he said finally, with a slight hint of frustration. "My job requires me to be in controlled environments, where every detail is planned. Perhaps by observing how you handle casual situations, I can learn to face my own blocks." Lily smiled, not resisting the chance to tease him a little. "Let me get this straight. You want me to teach you how to relax?" He looked at her fixedly, without any humor in his eyes. "If you prefer to put it that way, yes," he replied, with a stiffness that made it clear that this was not a joke to him. She nodded, pretending not to notice the tension on his face. "It's okay, Mr. Grant. I'll try my best to teach you how to deal with the unpredictable," he replied, trying to remain serious. She knew this wouldn't be easy. Something about her told her that Nick was the kind of person who hated giving up control. He finally relaxed a little and nodded. "Great. We can start tomorrow. Be here at 10 o'clock sharp." She nodded, and as soon as he walked away, she let out a sigh of relief. That interaction had been strange and intense, but now the anticipation of seeing what the next day would bring made her smile internally. The next day, Promptly at 10, Lily showed up in the lobby, wearing comfortable clothes and carrying a backpack full of random items she thought might be useful. Upon seeing her, Nick frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the lack of formality, but didn't comment. They went up to his apartment in dense silence. As soon as they entered, Lily looked around and was amazed at her surroundings. Everything seemed carefully organized, without a single object out of place. The surfaces shined, and there was nothing to indicate that anyone actually lived there. She wondered how anyone could live in such a sterilized space. Nick watched her as she surveyed her surroundings, noticing her discomfort and curiosity. He tried to ignore the sense of invasion he felt, reminding himself that this was the reason he had hired her. He needed to face this feeling of discomfort, even if it made him feel like he was losing control. "First lesson," she said, turning to him with a mischievous smile. "Let's mess things up a little." Nick's eyes widened, clearly alarmed. "Mess up? Is that really necessary?" She laughed, shaking her head. "If you want to get out of your comfort zone, yes. Trust me, this will help you." Without waiting for a response, she began moving small objects, switching them around, changing the sofa cushions, and even undoing part of the impeccably organized curtains. Nick watched, fighting the urge to put everything back in order, his eyes fixed on everything she touched. But he resisted, with a strength of will that seemed almost painful. For him, each change was like a small chaos being implanted in his world. Finally, he took a deep breath and decided to focus on observing how she behaved naturally, without worrying about small disturbances. Lily noticed his tension and tried to lighten the atmosphere by starting to talk about random things. He talked about his childhood, his passion for art, and how much he loved the idea that nothing in the world was permanent. He listened to her with a mixture of fascination and incomprehension, trying to understand how someone could approach life in such a carefree way. For her, this was more than a simple task. It was an opportunity to share something he believed in, even with someone who seemed to be his complete opposite. For him, it was a torturous exercise, but part of him was beginning to understand the value of giving in a little, of accepting that not everything could be controlled. By the end of the morning, when Lily had finished her little chaos session, Nick felt exhausted, as if he had faced an intense test. She said goodbye with a smile, promising to return the next day for another lesson. As she left, he looked around, noticing the small traces of change she had left behind. It was uncomfortable, yes, but it was also a reminder that perhaps the world outside his control wasn't as threatening as he imagined. A seed of doubt and perhaps curiosity had been planted. The next day, Lily was waiting for Nick in front of the building with a confident and relaxed expression. Nick, on the other hand, looked exhausted before the day even started. Dressed in an impeccably pressed shirt and without a hair out of place, he maintained a serious expression as he watched the young woman with a mixture of trepidation and curiosity. Lily, as always, had that laid-back look and carefree smile, as if life were a smooth flow without setbacks. That posture made him uncomfortable, but he wouldn't let her notice. Instead, he nodded to indicate he was ready, even though every fiber of his being screamed against what they were about to do. "Let's go to a cafe," Lily said enthusiastically, as if she had just thought of the idea. Nick frowned hesitantly. "A coffee with other people?" The question came out with a tone of disapproval that she couldn't help but notice. Lily laughed, amused by his reluctance. "Yes, Nick, with other people. And of course, with a touch of spontaneity. I think you'll like it. It's a place full of color and life." Nick sighed, resigned. Despite all his reservations, there was something that drove him forward. It was an uncomfortable combination of curiosity and an urgency he still didn't fully understand. After all, he had already made the decision to test himself, to leave the circle of absolute control in which he lived. If he was going to truly experience chaos, he needed to start somewhere, even if the idea of being in a busy place caused him a slight aversion. During the ride, Lily talked excitedly about the coffee she planned to take him to. He explained about the art on the walls, the vibrant colors that gave the room a welcoming feel, and how every detail seemed to have its own story. He listened to her attentively, even if he didn't show it. As she spoke, Nick began to notice something peculiar. To Lily, each space seemed like more than just a physical place. It was as if she saw hidden meanings and nuances that he, trapped in his need for order and control, would never have noticed. When they arrived at the cafe, Nick hesitated for a moment before entering. The facade was cheerful, with flowers and colorful paintings, very different from the minimalist places he frequented, where each line was precise and each color neutral. He took a deep breath, preparing himself to face what he imagined would be an exhausting experience. Lily, noticing the tension on his face, gave him an encouraging look. "You'll survive, Nick," she teased, winking at him. Inside the cafe, the atmosphere was cozy but chaotic in Nick's eyes. There were tables of different shapes and sizes, all occupied by people who seemed absorbed in warm, relaxed conversations. Pictures and illustrations were scattered across the walls, none of them lined up evenly, creating a sense of visual disarray that made him swallow hard. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the sweet aroma of freshly baked bread, creating an atmosphere he couldn't define. The vibration of the place was almost alive, pulsating, as if each object had its own energy. Lily chose a table in the center, where the movement was most intense, and motioned for him to sit. Reluctantly, Nick complied. The sound of voices around him and the light music in the background seemed like a constant challenge to his concentration. He looked around, trying to absorb his surroundings and at the same time remain calm. He felt like an intruder, someone who clearly didn't belong there. He realized that he was not the type of person who attracted attention. It was invisible in its own coldness, while Lily, on the other hand, exuded a kind of natural charisma, a radiance that seemed to attract glances. She noticed his discomfort and with a mischievous smile, said, "Nick, relax. We're not here to be analyzed. Just enjoy the moment." He opened his mouth to retort, but decided to hold back. Something in him didn't want to seem fragile or out of place in front of her, even though he knew he was. When the waitress approached, Lily smiled and placed an order for a latte and a carrot cake with cream frosting, explaining in detail that she loved the place's recipe. Nick, in turn, ordered a simple black coffee, and even that seemed to be difficult for him. The act of ordering something so informally made him feel like he was breaking a barrier he had built up over the years. The waitress left, and Lily, watching him curiously, asked, "So Nick, why did you actually decide to do this? It doesn't seem like the kind of thing someone as fastidious as you would go for." Nick looked away to avoid her face, focusing on a random spot on the wall. "I think maybe I've gotten too comfortable in my own routine," he replied, choosing his words carefully. "I've always maintained a rigid structure, but lately I've felt like it's holding me back. That maybe, somehow it's keeping me away from something important." Lily watched him, surprised by his honesty. For the first time, he saw a trace of vulnerability in Nick, a break in the calculated coldness. He seemed uncomfortable admitting what he had just said, but something about him made her want to get to know him beyond his controlled facade. He decided to respect the moment without pressuring him, limiting himself to an understanding smile as he observed his face marked by tension. Minutes later, the waitress brought the orders. While Lily enthusiastically tasted her cake, Nick took a careful sip of his coffee. The taste was bitter, but somehow familiar. He looked around once again, and when he saw people chatting in a relaxed manner, he felt a hint of envy. He noticed how the interactions around him seemed uncomplicated, as if each person there was connected to the environment and to the others, while he continued to observe everything from the outside, like a spectator in a world that was not his own. By now, Lily was already talking to the people at the next table. A friendly couple who seemed to frequent the cafe regularly recognized her and began exchanging stories about travel and food. Nick, in turn, observed the interaction as if he were watching an experiment. He was fascinated and confused by Lily's ease in dealing with strangers, laughing and sharing trivial details of her life. The simple act of talking seemed easy to her, while he struggled to understand why a casual conversation with strangers could be so enjoyable. "You seem very comfortable talking to anyone," Nick commented, unable to contain his surprise. Lily looked at him with a playful smile and replied, "It's because I like people, Nick. Each person has a story, something that can teach me or inspire me, and I can bring something to them too. It's like a constant exchange." He was silent, Thinking about it, it was a prospect he had never considered. For him, people represented obligations and expectations, something he avoided as much as possible, as any relationship required openness to the unpredictable, to mistakes. In his mind, the ideal was to maintain an organized and predictable life, where nothing and no one could destabilize his peace. And yet, there he was, fascinated by someone who saw the chaos of interactions as a source of energy and joy. As the coffee progressed, Lily noticed that Nick was still uncomfortable, but she noticed something else. He was paying attention to how the people around him interacted. At every moment, it seemed like he was trying to unravel a new enigma, to understand what attracted him to that environment that in his eyes was a mess. At one point, Lily decided to step up the challenge. "I'm going to the counter to pick out another drink. Would you like to come with me?" she asked, already knowing the answer, but eager to see him deal with the situation. "I'd rather stay here," he replied bluntly, but Lily laughed and insisted. "Come on, Nick. It's just a line. You'll survive." He hesitated, but stood up, walking to the counter with her. On the way, a lady passed by him, lightly bumping into his arm without realizing it. The minimal contact was enough for him to tense up, but he held himself back, taking deep breaths, as Lily had instructed him to do before they left. While Lily chose a cold drink, Nick looked around with an appraising expression. At the counter, the clerk seemed familiar with the chaotic flow of orders, treating each customer with a casual attention that left him intrigued. When Lily finished her order, she pulled him to the table, bringing with her the new drink and a cupcake, which she offered to Nick. He looked at the cupcake with a mixture of disgust and curiosity. "I don't know if I'm ready to eat something that wasn't planned," he muttered, not realizing he was speaking out loud. Lily laughed and encouraged him to take just one bite as a small step. The first bite was a simple experience, but for him, it represented a breaking of barriers. The sweet taste contrasted with the bitterness of the coffee, and he suddenly realized there was something liberating about accepting small new things. He looked at Lily with new eyes, noticing how she made the world around him seem less threatening, more accessible. As they finished their coffee, Lily suggested they take a short walk around the nearby square. He hesitated, but her energy convinced him. They walked through the wooded space, and he noticed how people looked at him less than he expected, as if the world was going on normally, without caring about their tensions. Lily played with the leaves and watched the birds, as if every detail was a new discovery. With each step, Nick felt the tension lessen, as if the chaos became less intimidating and more of a chance to discover a new way of being in the world. At the end of the day, he said goodbye to Lily with a feeling of tiredness, but also a strange contentment. For the first time, he had allowed himself to be out of absolute control. And even though it left him vulnerable, he had found a new perspective. As he walked home, he reflected on everything he had experienced in that cafe and on the sidewalk. Lily had intrigued him, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like the world outside his rigid bubble might offer something he couldn't predict, and maybe he was okay with that. That sunny afternoon, Lily invited Nick to visit her studio. She was excited about the idea of showing him a piece of her world, where she felt more free and creative, surrounded by canvases and brushes, vibrant strokes and scattered paint stains. Nick accepted the invitation, although a part of him was uncertain about what awaited him. He knew that his environment and hers were opposites, that he would face a disorganized, chaotic reality, where nothing would follow the rules that were so essential to him. But something about Lily drew him to this universe he had never explored. She seemed to belong to a vibrant, dynamic world that he had only observed from afar, without allowing himself to enter. Arriving at the old building that housed Lily's studio, Nick was taken aback. The building, unlike anything he was used to, was a little worn out, with peeling walls and an entrance full of graffiti and posters for artistic events. Upon entering, he found a narrow, poorly lit corridor with wooden doors that showed the wear and tear of time. The smell of paint and solvent permeated the room, something he would normally consider unpleasant, but which now seemed to complement the atmosphere of the place. Nick followed Lily in silence, watching her move naturally, as if that place were an extension of herself. When they finally arrived at the studio, Lily opened the door with a smile, waving him inside. Nick hesitated for a brief moment, but took a step forward, feeling like he was crossing an invisible boundary. The interior of the studio was an explosion of colors and shapes. There were canvases of all sizes spread across the walls, some finished, others still in the process of being created. Brushes of different shapes and sizes were organized in meticulous chaos inside improvised pots and boxes. The floor, marked by paint splatters, seemed to tell a story of its own, as if each stain was evidence of Lily's hours of dedication. He looked around with a mix of curiosity and strangeness. For Nick, the disorderly environment was almost disconcerting, but he couldn't look away. There was an intensity there, an energy that intrigued him. Every corner of the studio exuded Lily's personality, which he was beginning to perceive as a genuine reflection of her essence. It was as if in that space, he could see a raw, authentic version of her that he didn't yet fully know. Lily was visibly at ease. He moved with a relaxed ease, showing him his paintings and explaining the process behind each one. She talked about her inspirations, about the emotions she tried to capture and transform into colors, about how ideas appeared like flashes in her mind, and how each brushstroke was an attempt to translate what she felt. As she spoke, Nick watched her, absorbing every word, as if she were a window into something he himself didn't understand, but longed to understand. However, amid his fascination with Lily's universe, something caught Nick's attention. In the far corner of the studio, near a window that let in the late afternoon light, he saw an old painting. The painting was different from the others. The colors were softer, less vibrant, as if they belonged to another time. He approached slowly, feeling a chill run across his skin. The signature, a small scribble in the lower right corner, caught his eye. The surname Porter was written there, in cursive and slightly shaky letters, like a handwritten signature. A vague memory appeared in his mind. He frowned, trying to identify why that name seemed so familiar. It was as if something buried in his memory had been awakened, a forgotten fragment that now refused to return to silence. He reached out, almost touching the screen, but pulled back at the last moment. There was an unsettling feeling growing inside him, a kind of recognition he couldn't explain. Lily, noticing Nick's attention, came closer and smiled. "Ah, that's one of my mother's paintings," she said, with a tone of affection and nostalgia. "She was a great inspiration to me. She always painted since she was young, and she used to say that art was a way to express herself when words weren't enough." Lily looked at the screen tenderly, as if she were revisiting an important part of her own story. The mention of Lily's mother only intensified Nick's uneasiness. He didn't remember clearly, but the word Porter now echoed in his mind, almost like a whisper. I couldn't determine where this memory came from. All he knew was that that name disturbed him. He tried to shake off the discomfort, but the fragment of memory persisted, like an incomplete puzzle he couldn't ignore. "Was she also an artist?" he asked, trying to hide the confusion he felt. His tone was softer than usual, perhaps out of respect for what the painting represented to Lily. "Yes," Lily replied with a twinkle in her eye. "She taught me everything I know. She used to take me to museums and galleries when I was a kid. I think it was her way of showing me that the world is full of possibilities, that there isn't just one way of seeing things." Lily's words resonated with Nick, as if they were silently dismantling his beliefs. What bothered him was not just the fact that that painting had awakened a forgotten memory. It was the feeling that there was an inexplicable connection between him and Lily, a connection that transcended the present, something hidden in a past he had never allowed himself to revisit. And the more he thought about it, the more he felt he needed to understand what that connection meant, even if it required facing parts of himself that he had kept locked away. Lily continued to show her paintings, talking about the techniques she learned, the ideas she developed. She seemed to get lost in his words, enchanted by her own passion, and Nick watched her, absorbing every detail. At some point, he realized that she had become the center of his focus, more than any painting in the studio. She was a person who lived between colors and textures, between stories and feelings. While he was a man accustomed to seeing the world in black and white, to reducing things to simple, defined categories, with Lily, everything seemed to gain another perspective, as if her world were a screen that he had never known how to interpret. He noticed that her mother's signature remained in his mind, persistent. The vague memory felt like a shadow, a childhood memory he couldn't fully access, but he knew it was there, waiting to be unlocked. At some point, he looked away, trying to shake off the feeling of strangeness, but it was in vain. It was as if the name Porter had become a riddle he needed to solve. Lily, noticing his prolonged silence, asked, "Are you okay, Nick? You look like you've seen a ghost." Nick hesitated, but in the end, he decided to answer truthfully, even if vaguely. I don't know, that name sounds familiar. I don't know where from, but it feels like I've heard it before." Lily looked at him, surprised. "Really? Maybe you've seen her work in a gallery or exhibition. My mother exhibited some works in museums when she was younger, before she left her career to raise me." He nodded, but he felt the answer wasn't that simple. Something deep and almost forgotten cried out to be remembered, but he couldn't grasp the memory. Lily went back to talking about her mother, her memories and stories, and Nick tried to listen carefully, hoping that some word or detail would bring light to the restlessness in his chest. As she continued talking about her childhood, about her happy memories with her mother, Nick felt a mixture of curiosity and anxiety. Her words were like pieces of a puzzle, but none of them fit the empty space he was trying to fill in his mind. He kept remembering fragments of a scene, perhaps a distant memory from his own childhood, where a woman or a vague image of someone seemed to speak to him. But as soon as he tried to delve deeper, the memory slipped away, leaving only the feeling that something important had been forgotten. Time passed without him noticing, until Lily turned to him and touched his arm, bringing him back to the present. "So what do you think of my space? Chaotic enough for you?" he asked, smiling. Nick, still a little lost in his thoughts, forced a smile and nodded. "It's interesting. I don't know if chaotic is the word I would use, but it's definitely different." She laughed and gave him a light push on the shoulder, noticing his effort to adapt. "I'll take that as a compliment then." At that moment, he realized that her presence was a kind of anchor, something that kept him centered and at the same time pushed him to seek answers. She was everything he wasn't, a person willing to explore the unknown, to accept the unpredictable. And somehow, this nature encouraged him to face his own shadows, to confront the mysteries he had always avoided. When they said goodbye, Nick left the studio with a renewed sense of restlessness. The signature on the painting continued to haunt her mind, as did Lily's words about her mother and her memories. On the way home, he tried to analyze the emotions that invaded him. There was something about Lily's story that seemed intertwined with his, a mystery he couldn't escape. That night, lying in his bed, Nick couldn't shake the memory of that last name. He tried to reorganize the fragments of his childhood, excavate memories he didn't know existed. He closed his eyes, concentrating, searching for any clue that would take him to the past. Vague, hazy images appeared in his mind, indistinct faces, distant voices. But one sensation was clear. He felt a strange sense of loss, of something that had been ripped from his life without explanation. As he struggled to remember, the image of Lily's mother's painting continued to haunt him. The signature, the soft colors, the nostalgic touch of the painting seemed to carry secrets that he still didn't understand. Lily's presence in his life, although recent, was beginning to transform into something much bigger than he imagined. She wasn't just someone who pushed him out of his comfort zone. It was a link to a past that he had left behind, and that, in some way, now returned. That night, restlessness kept Nick from sleeping. He tossed and turned in bed, feeling as if he were trapped in a spiral of thoughts that he couldn't control. The signature Porter seemed to echo in his mind, a faint but constant sound, like a long-forgotten melody. He tried to remember any detail, any clue that connected that surname to some memory from his childhood, but all he could manage was a haze of disconnected images and vague sensations, fragments that did not form a cohesive memory. With each attempt, he felt the discomfort grow, as if he were about to discover something that would forever change the way he saw his own past. After a few hours of sleeplessness, Nick got up and went to his home office. The environment, always so silent and organized, offered him a feeling of control, but at that moment, even the air felt heavy. She sat down at her computer and hesitated before typing the name Margaret Porter into the search field. It was strange looking for someone he barely knew, but something in his instinct drove him. There was an uncontrollable need to understand who this woman was who meant so much to Lily and who, in some way, also seemed to be linked to him. The initial search brought few results, but with some tweaking, he found an old article that talked about an exhibition at a small art gallery. The article mentioned Margaret Porter as an emerging artist, with her own distinctive style, something that made her stand out in the local art scene. The text mentioned that Margaret Porter had exhibited several works alongside other artists, and among them there was a name that made Nick's heart race: Anne Grant. Seeing his mother's name next to Margaret Porter's, Nick felt a rush of surprise and confusion. He remembered very little about his mother, but her name had always been associated with the image of a sweet woman with a soft and distant look. She had passed away when he was still very young, leaving behind only a few objects and photos that his father had kept with extreme care. Her memory was almost like a blurry portrait, something he never truly fully understood. But suddenly, there she was, connected to a woman who was apparently Lily's mother. Nick stared at the article, reading and rereading the paragraph as if the words could provide him with some explanation. The mention of Anne Grant alongside Margaret Porter was direct, but at the same time, it left everything open-ended. He needed more. He needed to know how their lives had become intertwined and what exactly united his mother and Lily's mother. He looked for other mentions about the exhibition, and with a little effort, he found a link to an even older article published in an art magazine. There was a grainy image of the exhibition, a group of people posing in front of a wall of paintings, and among them, two young women, side by side, smiling at the camera. Nick's heart jumped when he recognized his mother's face in the photo. Even with the poor image quality, he could see the soft and warm expression that looked so familiar despite being hazy. Beside her was a woman he assumed was Margaret Porter. She had a different posture, her face with a more serious expression, but there was an undeniable closeness between the two. They were side by side, arms almost touching, with restrained smiles that, somehow, suggested an intimacy that went beyond casualness. Looking at the image, Nick had the strangest feeling that somehow he and Lily had been connected since before they were born. He enlarged the image as much as he could, taking in every detail. Something about his mother's face intrigued him. It was as if she carried a secret, a mystery she might never have shared. Nick felt an emptiness, an absence that now became more tangible as he realized he knew very little about her past. She had grown up with her father, a reserved man who never spoke much about Anne. After her death, his father seemed to have withdrawn into a shell, and Nick, still very young, had accepted this as natural, without question. Looking at the photo, he felt like a crucial part of his own story was missing, as if the events of his mother's life had been erased from his memory and the memories of everyone around him. He spent the next few minutes analyzing each face in the image, trying to recognize something familiar, some detail that could awaken new memories. But everything seemed distant, as if it belonged to another life, to another person. However, he knew he couldn't stop there. There was something bigger he needed to discover, something that would change the way he saw not only his mother, but also himself. Deciding to dig deeper, he began searching for additional information about the exhibit. He discovered that the gallery where it took place still existed, but under a new name and management. He tried to find records about Margaret Porter and Anne Grant, but information was scarce. Most mentions seemed to focus on Margaret's artistic career, while Anne Grant was just a shadow, mentioned in passing, almost like a forgotten detail. Nick felt a strange frustration rise within him. It was as if his mother had been erased from history, as if nothing of her life had survived except the blurred image he carried. He spent hours in front of the computer, exploring every article, every reference, but he found only fragments, disjointed pieces of a story that he couldn't understand. At one point, he came across an article that mentioned a tragic accident involving Margaret Porter and a significant loss to the artistic community. The text spoke in melancholic tones, suggesting that she had left the artistic world due to a traumatic event. Nick felt his chest tighten as he realized that the lines in the article didn't clarify what had happened. They only mentioned a sudden break. The pieces of the puzzle seemed impossible to put together. His mother and Lily's mother had been so close, but now, years later, he found himself isolated from everything that connected them. He felt frustrated and even irritated by the silence that covered the past. What should have been a familiar story seemed like a cold mystery, something untouched for years and now revealing itself to him in a fragmented way, like a memory locked in a safe. He wondered if his father knew anything, but the man was reclusive and distant, and Nick was hesitant to bring up the subject for fear of reopening old wounds. On the screen, the photo from the exhibition continued, his mother smiling next to Margaret Porter. Nick felt torn between the need to know the truth and the fear of what that truth might reveal. It was an anguish he had never experienced. He had grown up believing that he knew enough about his own life, that his past held no secrets, and that he could control everything that concerned his world. But now, faced with these discoveries, he realized that perhaps there was an untold story, a hidden narrative that directly affected him and that he had never imagined. The memory of Lily came to his mind like a shock. He thought of the woman he had met so recently, with her light, chaotic energy, and how she seemed far from any secret or suffering. The idea that his mother's lives were connected in such an intimate way was disturbing, but at the same time it gave him a strange sense of belonging, as if he had somehow found a bridge to his own past. He suddenly felt the urgency to talk to Lily, to confront her about everything he had discovered, but he knew he needed to be careful. She had no idea he was digging into this past, and the last thing he wanted was to scare her or invade her own memories. He decided he needed to see this gallery in person, explore the place where his mother and Margaret had met, understand what might have been lost to time. Maybe there I would find some answer, something that justified the emptiness I felt. Over the next few days, he was unable to concentrate on his work as the image of his mother and Margaret continued to haunt him, a constant reminder that his story was incomplete. That night, before going to sleep, he looked at the photo in the exhibition again. His mother's face seemed to smile at him, as if she knew something he didn't. She looked happy, and Nick felt a pang of sadness as he realized he had never really known her. He only knew what his father had told him, that she was a sweet and reserved woman, but he had never imagined that she had a life before him. A life that included friendships, secrets, and perhaps even regrets. The connection between his mother and Margaret Porter seemed surreal, but at the same time inevitable. There was a bond between him and Lily that was beyond his control, something greater than any choice he could make now. He realized that, whether he liked it or not, that woman who had appeared so unexpectedly in his life was the key to unlocking his own past. The next morning, with a silent decision, Nick quickly got ready and headed towards the gallery. He knew that, as disturbing as it was, he needed to face the answers that awaited him, as it was the only way to finally understand what those forgotten memories meant. In the following days, Nick began to observe Lily with renewed attention. He hadn't mentioned the discovery about her mother, but he felt the weight of the secret growing with each encounter. With every moment they spent together, he fought the urge to confront her, to ask her directly what she knew about Margaret Porter and Anne Grant. But at the same time, an instinct kept him silent. Maybe it was the fear of reopening wounds, or the fear that she didn't know anything, and he would have to deal with the implications alone. Thus, he preferred to remain silent, allowing the pieces of this enigma to reveal themselves little by little, in the hope that a new detail would emerge naturally. Instead of sharing what he had discovered, Nick began to observe Lily almost obsessively. I analyzed her gestures, her expressions, and even the things she said casually. Sometimes he wondered if it was possible that she knew something and was hiding it. Other times, I thought this hypothesis was absurd. She seemed so free, so relaxed and spontaneous, without the slightest hint that she could carry such a big secret. And yet he couldn't shake the doubt. He began to wonder how much he actually knew about her and her story. The meetings, which previously had a natural lightness, were now filled with an almost palpable silence, which Nick justified as prudence, but which was beginning to be noticed by Lily. The discomfort he felt around her was visible, and even though she tried to hide it, She noticed the nuances in his behavior, the furtive glances and the tone of voice that had become more restrained and, on some occasions, almost distant. Instead of laughing at her jokes, as he did at first, he now responded with a brief, forced smile. Lily, who had always been sensitive to people's mood swings, noticed something was wrong, but couldn't understand what could have happened to make him act so differently. One cold morning, they met in a park where they used to walk together. Lily had suggested the place because she knew Nick liked the quiet of the mornings, where the movement was calmer and he didn't feel overwhelmed. They walked side by side for some time, but after a few minutes, she decided to break the silence. "You walk different, Nick. I feel like something has changed, and I don't know why." He remained silent for a moment, looking away at the trees. The question had taken him by surprise, but he knew that, eventually, she would notice the distance. "I'm no different," he replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Maybe I just have more things on my mind." However, he knew his answer was not convincing. Lily looked at him with a serious expression, trying to understand what was going on behind his strict facade. "It's not just that," she insisted. "I feel like you're pulling away. It feels like there's something you want to tell me, but you can't." The vulnerability in her voice surprised Nick. She was right. There was something he needed to share, but insecurity prevented him from taking that step. Despite this, he stuck to his decision and chose to evade. "Not everything needs to be talked about, Lily. Sometimes it's better to keep some things to ourselves." He avoided her gaze, keeping his attention on the leaves that fell softly around him. Deep down, the answer served him more than her, justifying his own silence and his inability to share the weight of what he had discovered. Lily sighed, clearly frustrated. "It's okay, Nick. If you don't want to talk, I won't pressure you, but know that I'm here, willing to listen." The sincerity in her voice touched him, and for a brief moment he almost allowed himself to open up, almost confess the discoveries about the connections between their families. But the thought of confronting her possible reaction made him hesitate. He still needed time, clearer answers, before bringing to light a truth that perhaps not even he himself was ready to accept. From that day on, the dynamics between the two became even more delicate. Lily tried to fill the empty space between them with stories from her childhood, memories that brought to light her connection with art, with colors and the precious moments she had shared with her mother. She mentioned the visits they made to museums and galleries, the long afternoons when her mother painted while telling her stories about artists who had transformed the world with their brushes and visions. Each of these memories carried an innocent joy and a deep nostalgia, which Nick listened to, the tension and growing tension. He wondered to what extent those memories might also be linked to his own mother, to the time Margaret and Anne spent together. During an afternoon when they worked side by side in the studio, Nick watched Lily paint with an expression that mixed concentration and tranquility. Her movements were fluid, almost dancing, as if she was in tune with each line and color that appeared. He watched her as if he wanted to absorb every detail of her personality, searching for any clue as to what she knew, any indication that those hands, holding the brushes so naturally, carried a piece of the mystery that haunted him. Sometimes Lily would look up and catch him watching her, but he would quickly look away, pretending he was just lost in thought. The emotional distance between them widened almost imperceptibly, but it was real. For Lily, Nick's attitude became more and more confused, as if he were an enigma that became more and more complex. She wanted to help him, but she realized that no matter how hard she tried, he was putting up invisible barriers between them. He seemed to have enclosed himself in an impenetrable shell, an armor that kept him protected but also isolated him. One night, while they were sitting in a small cafe, she tried once again to get closer. "Nick, I want to understand what's going on. If you don't want to talk, that's fine, but it's getting hard to keep pretending that I don't notice you're away." He took a deep breath, feeling cornered, but at the same time knowing that she deserved an answer. He looked at her, and for an instant, saw the reflection of his own uneasiness on Lily's face. I've been thinking a lot about the past," he said, choosing his words carefully. "There are some things I can't understand, things that are in the past that are coming back in some form. And honestly, I don't know what to do with it." Lily watched him silently, noticing the conflict he was trying to hide. She didn't know what he meant exactly, but she felt the depth of his anguish. It was a side of Nick I rarely saw, a vulnerable and almost tragic side, hidden beneath layers of control and perfection. Without hesitation, she reached out and touched his arm, a gesture that seemed simple but carried emotional weight. He didn't retreat, but he didn't move either, keeping his gaze fixed on hers, as if he was looking for something that only she could offer. She tried to convey her understanding through that touch, a silent gesture that meant support, even without words. "Nick, the past is part of who we are, but it doesn't have to define everything. Maybe you're holding on too much to something that, in the end, doesn't matter so much." She said that without knowing the weight her words had for him. To Nick, who was desperately trying to understand the connections he had discovered, that suggestion seemed like a direct challenge, as if the past he was searching for was less relevant than he thought. But at the same time, I felt that maybe she was right, that maybe it was possible to continue without unraveling all the mysteries. That night ended without any major revelations, but something changed for Nick. The softness in Lily's touch and the empathy in her voice made him reflect on the importance he was giving to discoveries about his mother's. Even so, when he arrived home, he felt the need to return to the image of the two in the exhibition. His mother's face next to Margaret Porter continued to hold him in a way he couldn't explain. It was as if a part of himself was there, trapped in that memory, waiting to be discovered. In the days that followed, Nick tried to approach Lily in a more subtle way, but something inside him continued to create barriers. He couldn't ignore the mystery that united them, and no matter how hard he tried, the doubt persisted. Perhaps he was protecting himself from possible disappointment, or perhaps it was the fear of seeing his own feelings change as the secret was revealed. But Lily, who had always noticed even the smallest changes in behavior around her, didn't fail to notice Nick's internal dilemma. Every time he closed down, she felt the tension build, which made her feel even more distant, like he was becoming a stranger again. The relationship that seemed to be gradually deepening began to recede, and she felt growing frustration, not knowing how she could help. One night, as they said goodbye after a particularly quiet day, Lily finally confronted him with painful honesty. "Nick, I really don't know what's going on between us, but I feel like something has changed since we started this journey. It feels like you're stuck in something, and it's stopping you from moving forward, from trusting, and that it's pushing us away." He was silent, unable to find an answer. Her words hit a nerve, but at the same time, he knew he couldn't force an opening he wasn't ready to offer yet. There was a truth between them that was at the same time a barrier, and as long as he couldn't deal with the past, that gulf would continue to separate them. That night, Nick returned home with an empty feeling. Lily's words echoed in his mind, and he began to realize that the mystery of the past that he so feared unraveling was not just a personal quest, but something that was directly impacting the relationship he was beginning to build with her. The coldness and distance he maintained as a defense were also the barriers that prevented him from being truthful, both with himself and with her. One silent night, Lily found herself in her apartment, enveloped by a feeling of restlessness that she couldn't explain. Ever since Nick started acting distant and reserved, she felt disturbed, as if something was slipping between them. She had always been intuitive, capturing details and emotions almost involuntarily, and Nick's growing distance had not gone unnoticed. There was a cloud of mystery around him, something he guarded so jealously that it sometimes made her doubt whether she really knew him. That night, unable to sleep, she sat on the floor of the small makeshift studio in her apartment, surrounded by boxes and old belongings that she had kept since she was a teenager. Among these items, one box in particular caught his attention. It was made of dark, weathered wood, with a small, rusty lock that never really locked. She knew what was inside: objects and mementos of her mother, a collection of memories that Lily kept as an anchor, especially in moments of doubt and loneliness. She opened the box carefully, as if the object carried more than memories, as if it held fragments of a person who no longer existed. Inside, he found letters, old photographs, small personal objects, and at the bottom, a hardcover notebook. It was her mother's diary, something Lily rarely revisited. The last time he had opened it was shortly after her death, a dark period that had left marks that he still carried with him. Now, with a heavy heart and aroused curiosity, she slowly leafed through the pages, seeking some consolation or perhaps an answer to the doubts that tormented her. As he read the notes, he found records of ordinary days, impressions of works of art, ideas for paintings and deep reflections on life and the difficulties his mother had faced. Lily noticed the complexity and sensitivity of that woman who, many times, preferred to express her pains and dreams in the colors of the canvas. However, something unexpectedly caught his attention. When he turned a page towards the end of the diary, he found the name Grant written several times in different contexts. At first, he thought it was a mistake or coincidence, but he soon realized that his mother mentioned the Grant family as influential and enigmatic people, a constant presence in her life during a period of her youth. Lily felt her heart race. Was it the same family as Nick? She tried to remember if he had ever mentioned anything about his past or family, but realized that she actually knew little about him other than what Nick had allowed her to see. He was a closed person, careful with every word and extremely meticulous about what he shared. The idea that the name Grant could be linked to the mystery surrounding Nick's recent behavior became more than a suspicion. The diary excerpt was vague, but her mother talked about a time when she lived with the Grants, describing them as a powerful family, but marked by something dark. Lily noticed that her mother wasn't very clear about what that something dark meant, but the phrase intrigued her. As she continued reading, she found fragments that suggested a deep connection between her mother and someone in that family, but the words were fragmented, almost as if her mother was struggling with something she didn't want to remember. In one excerpt, he found a phrase that seemed to echo in Lily's mind, something that carried a weight that she didn't fully understand. Some secrets need to be buried, even if it means living with the pain of never fully understanding. That sentence gave her goosebumps. The mention of secrets, something hidden and possibly painful, awakened in her a feeling of emptiness, as if there was a part of her mother's story that had always been hidden from her. Lily had never known much about her mother's youth, and it had never seemed like an important question to her. But now, suddenly, she found herself immersed in questions she didn't know how to answer. Who were the Grants to your mother? Why did she describe them with such ambiguity? And above all, what was the relationship between all this and Nick himself? While leafing through the diary looking for more clues, Lily found references to social events and visits to an art gallery that her mother had attended alongside influential people. Her mother mentioned her closeness to a woman called Anne, who Lily assumed was Anne Grant, but she never clarified the type of relationship they had. The way he described this Anne was filled with admiration, almost as if there was a friendship between them, or at least a strong and deep bond. On one page, her mother had written, "Anne understands me in a way no one else does, but I fear her life is full of complications she doesn't know how to face." Lily frowned, trying to decipher the meaning of those words. It was possible that Anne had been an important figure in her mother's life, someone who perhaps played a crucial role in her artistic or personal formation. But then, why had her mother written with so much melancholy and suspicion? Was it possible that Anne had gone through something that had affected not only her, but also her mother? Lily felt the weight of these questions growing in her mind, but she knew she would need more to put the puzzle together. As she read, an uncomfortable feeling came over her, as if her mother's diary were a portal to a world she had never been a part of. And that suddenly seemed closer than it had ever been. It was a strange connection with Nick, one she hadn't chosen and didn't know if she wanted to be a part of. What did it mean for her to discover that their lives were intertwined in such an unexpected way? The more she thought about it, the more she felt that Nick's withdrawal and his newfound coldness might be related to something deeper than he was willing to share. When she closed the diary, Lily felt conflicted. There was a part of her that wanted to confront Nick immediately, ask him what he knew about her mother, about Anne Grant and her relationship with Margaret Porter. But another part, more cautious, feared the answers he might give. What if he knew something? And if he had been investigating their past, how did she now begin to do so? If Nick carried secrets, maybe they were painful, maybe they were revelations she wasn't ready to hear. However, one detail in particular disturbed her. Each time he thought back to his mother's phrase about secrets that need to be buried, he felt that there was more than just nostalgic memories there. It was as if something tragic and painful was hidden in that relationship, instead of bringing comfort, as always happened when revisiting her mother's memories. The diary now left a feeling of restlessness and sadness, as if it brought to light a dark truth that her mother had never revealed in life. The mystery around Nick now seemed even greater, a maze of old memories and unspoken truths that, instead of bringing them closer together, was starting to push them apart. He became more and more of an enigma to her, and each encounter between them seemed wrapped in layers of tension and reserve. Lily, who had always been honest and spontaneous, now felt that she was carrying a secret that united her and at the same time separated her from Nick. A shadow from the past that weighed on them like an invisible burden. Deciding to investigate further, Lily spent the next few hours searching the internet for the name Anne Grant and references to any social event or gallery that included her and her mother. He found only one mention in an old article about an art exhibition, where both were mentioned as participants in the same gallery, confirming the suspicions that were beginning to grow in his mind. There were no photos, no details, but the brief mention was enough to show her that there was a closeness between the two. However, records were scant, as if Anne Grant's life had been carefully erased or left in oblivion. Every clue he found about his mother and the Grants was vague, incomplete, as if every step he took forward also brought more questions. She felt that she was approaching a hidden truth, something profound that perhaps even she herself would not be able to fully understand, but that she needed to confront in order to understand who the people involved in the story of her own life were. That night, when she ended her search, Lily felt exhausted, consumed by the weight of her discoveries and the mystery that hung between her and Nick. I knew I would need to talk to him, that I could no longer ignore the presence of that shadow in their lives. His mother's words echoed in his mind, a reminder of the past that could no longer be silenced. And although the fear of facing the truth was strong, her determination to discover what really connected their lives was even greater. It was a quiet, cold night, with the streets deserted and the sky overcast. Nick and Lily were sitting side by side in a small corner bar, lit only by the soft light of the candles on the tables. The environment was intimate and silent, providing an atmosphere conducive to deep conversations, but both seemed immersed in a hesitant silence, as if an invisible barrier kept them trapped in thoughts they dared not share. Over the past few days, the tension between them had become almost palpable, with the unspoken words and questions forming a kind of weight between them. Nick watched Lily from the corner of his eye, increasingly attentive to her gestures, to the expressions that revealed her uneasiness. There was an intensity in their gaze, an expectation that seemed to build, as if they both knew they were about to touch on a topic that would bring change. Lily was restless. Inside, she struggled with the weight of the discoveries made in her mother's diary and the urgency to share them with Nick. Ever since she read those cryptic words, she felt a growing need to talk about it, even if she feared his reaction or the response she might receive. She didn't know what he knew or if what he found really connected them in some way. But the truth was that she could no longer bear the burden of a secret that seemed bigger than her. Nick, on the other hand, seemed increasingly distant and lost in thought, which led her to suspect that he too was dealing with something he preferred to keep hidden. That night seemed to offer a rare opportunity, a moment of shared vulnerability that might never happen again. Taking a deep breath, Lily finally broke the silence. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried an intensity that made Nick immediately look away from her, as if he sensed that something important was about to be revealed. "You know, Nick," she began, choosing her words carefully, "sometimes I think about how different our lives might have been if certain things hadn't happened, especially about my mother. It's strange. She always seemed to carry a weight, something I never really understood when I was younger." Nick remained silent, but his gaze was fixed on her, his expression serious and attentive. Lily took the silence as a sign that he was listening with interest, and this encouraged her to continue. "After she was gone, I tried to find answers. She didn't talk much about the past, but not long ago, I found her diary, and it was only then that I realized how mysterious she was, how much there were things she never told me." Lily hesitated, The words seemed to want to come out, but fear made her hold back a few sentences, as if there was a limit she couldn't cross. She turned to face him, searching for something in his gaze that would help her feel safer. Nick remained expressionless, but the slight arching of his eyebrows and the way he breathed more slowly showed the intensity of his attention. "You know, she mentioned that she knew an important family," Lily continued, trying to keep her tone casual, even though her heart was racing as she spoke. "The Grants. She wrote about them a few times, as if there was a closeness, something important, but never detailed. She was always vague about it, but I felt like I knew them well. And honestly, it was something that resonated with me, because I never understood why she was so secretive about it." The mention of the surname caused a slight tremor in Nick's hand, something almost imperceptible, but which Lily noticed. He looked away momentarily, as if he needed to process what he had just heard, but remained silent, allowing her to continue. There was a tension in the air that he tried to hide, but the mention of the Grants had him on edge. Since discovering the photos and references in the article about his mother and Margaret Porter, Nick had struggled with the desire to tell Lily what he knew, but the fear of triggering painful memories kept him silent. Now, as he heard Lily mention the connection to his own mother, he felt torn between the urge to open up and the fear of what that might do. "It's weird, because I always imagined that I knew my mother completely, but in the end, it's like there are parts of her that she never revealed. And when I think about it, I feel like I'm stuck between moving forward and finding answers that maybe never be able to have." Lily continued, her voice filled with a sadness Nick had never heard before. "Do you have secrets in your family too, Nick? Do you feel like there's something that could change your life if you knew?" The question hung in the air, leaving him silent, torn between the desire to open up and the fear of revealing too much. The anguish in Lily's eyes was evident, and he knew she deserved an answer. That maybe sharing something would help her deal with the pain and uncertainty she carried. But there were so many layers and feelings mixed together in his mind that he hesitated. "We all have secrets," he finally replied, his voice low and introspective. "Sometimes they're things we choose not to remember. Sometimes they're memories we keep because we're afraid of the impact they might have. Maybe it's some of that your mother carried, something she thought was best left in the past." His words were careful, as if trying to deflect something he wasn't ready to confess. But Lily's expression showed a frustration she couldn't hide. She wanted answers, she needed them, and her patience seemed about to run out. "I just want to understand, Nick. I wish I could go back in time and ask her directly, but all I have are snippets, mentions that don't make sense, and leave me with even more questions. I feel like if I knew more, maybe it would be more. It's easy to move on, you know?" Nick nodded, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I understand," he murmured, so low it was barely audible. "Sometimes moving on is harder than simply accepting what we don't know. Maybe that mystery is part of who she was, and even if you don't have all the answers, that doesn't take away from the value of the memories you shared with her." Lily looked at him for a long moment, trying to decipher his words. The serenity with which Nick spoke seemed to hide something greater, a depth of pain and experience that he took pains to disguise. She began to feel that, in some way, Nick was also dealing with a weight from his past, something that perhaps was directly linked to the Grant mystery. But he closed himself off, keeping himself protected behind words that offered comfort without ever revealing what he really felt. An emotionally charged silence took over the room, with both of them lost in thought, each immersed in their own network of doubts and unspoken memories. Lily knew that this conversation was far from having the answers she wanted, but she felt that somehow Nick's words gave her a kind of temporary peace. It was as if he understood, even without saying it openly, what it meant to carry the weight of an unfinished past. After a few minutes, she sighed, resigned. "I just wish there was a way to understand why all this happened," she said, more to herself than to him. "It's a feeling of being so close, but at the same time of not being able to reach what I'm looking for." Nick looked away, feeling a lump in his throat. He knew exactly what that feeling was like, because he himself experienced it every time he came across the memories of his mother and the image of her next to Margaret Porter. The feeling that, even with all the details and clues, the mystery remained unreachable, always slightly out of reach. Finally, in an almost unconscious impulse, he allowed himself to touch her hand. A simple gesture, but full of meaning. The touch made him realize that Lily was his anchor in that sea of uncertainty. Someone who shared a similar pain, even if in a different way. She looked at him in surprise, but smiled tenderly, accepting that gesture as a show of silent support. A sign that he was there, even if the answers were still elusive. The conversation ended without any major revelations, but they both knew that something had changed. That sincere exchange, although full of half-truths and insecurities, created a deeper connection between them. Lily felt relieved to have shared some of her pain, to have confessed to the shadows that accompanied her. And Nick, listening to her, began to understand that perhaps silence and doubt were an essential part of his own answers. When Nick returned home that night, he felt strange, as if the conversation with Lily had opened doors he wasn't ready to cross. Her confession, filled with pain and mystery, had touched him in a way he couldn't explain, but it had also fueled his restlessness. She had mentioned the Grants, referred to the past with a sense of incompleteness that made him feel there was a real, deep bond between their families, something greater than he had imagined. And the idea that this connection hid a tragedy tormented him, as if, suddenly, all his questions were accompanied by an almost unbearable sense of urgency. Nick sat in front of the computer, unable to shake the need for answers. The relationship between Margaret Porter and Anne Grant was not just a detail lost to time, but something he felt pulsating in the present, a shadow that surrounded him more and more inescapably. He opened the browser and, with a mixture of anxiety and caution, typed Anne Grant accident in the search bar. The result was immediate. Old headlines, covered in the dust of time, appeared on the screen, bringing with them memories and feelings he could barely name. There, in the cold letters of the headlines, was his story. Tragedy claims Anne Grant's life in mysterious accident. Nick read each word with a sense of detachment, as if he were watching someone else's story. But the emotional impact was undeniable. As he scrolled through the old newspaper pages, he saw descriptions of the accident, the fatal collision on a deserted road on a rainy night. There were vague mentions of unusual circumstances, but not much detail. He had known about his mother's death since he was a child, but his father had never mentioned the details. Nick had grown up with the image of a sweet and distant woman, whose presence had been erased from his life before he even understood what the loss meant. Now, faced with these words, he realized how much he really didn't know about her story and about his own life. Nick continued to search for information, each new detail awakening mixed feelings. He spent hours reading the reports, absorbing details that he didn't even know existed before. Over time, he realized that the accident was a well-known event in the artistic world, an event that had deeply impacted Lily's mother, Margaret Porter. As he analyzed the news, he began to notice references to Margaret in texts and columns about the tragedy. She was described as a close friend of Anne Grant, someone who, according to some sources, dealt with the loss in a reclusive and melancholic manner, withdrawing from public life and ending her exhibitions shortly after the incident. These mentions aroused a new mix of curiosity and resentment in Nick. Margaret Porter's name now not only represented a connection to Lily, but seemed to be directly linked to the suffering her own family had experienced. She was an artist who had stopped appearing at events after Anne's death, a woman who had apparently carried the same pain that her father had kept silent for so many years. Nick didn't know how to process this. It was as if Margaret's presence had been there from the beginning, hidden beneath layers of fragmented memories and buried secrets, while he had never suspected a thing. While discovering more about Margaret, Nick came across a photograph taken months before the accident. She and Anne were side by side, both smiling at a gala event, their gaze showing an intimacy that he was now beginning to understand. There was a description under the photo that highlighted their partnership, describing them as inseparable and united by their passion for art. The word inseparable made Nick's chest tighten. He wondered if Margaret knew more than anyone else about her mother's final days, about the secrets she had carried until that tragic end. And then, he found a specific phrase that made him upset. In an art report covering Margaret's career, The text mentioned that she was known for her works that captured beauty amid chaos. The expression seemed harmless, but it resonated within Nick in a painful way, as if the chaos was somehow something she truly understood and perhaps had even experienced. He felt a wave of resentment rise in his chest. It was as if Margaret, Lily's mother, had been a silent witness to the suffering he and his father had carried throughout their lives. For a moment he felt betrayed, as if her presence at Anne's side had been a complicity he had never understood. The feeling of confusion and indignation was overwhelming. He wondered what Margaret knew, what she had never said, and what perhaps was still hidden away, waiting to be revealed. Nick spent the night awake, immersed in research and discoveries that, although fragmented, formed a clearer picture of the relationship between his mother and Margaret Porter. With each page he read, he felt closer to understanding the shadows of the past, but he also realized how much the weight of discoveries was eating away at his own present. Over the next few days, Nick became withdrawn, trapped in his own thoughts. Lily's presence, while comforting, was also a constant reminder of everything he didn't know about the past, and it disturbed him more than he was willing to admit. When they were together, he watched her with new eyes, trying to see in her the answers that Margaret had taken with her. It was as if her mother was still there, watching them in some way. A shadow that hung over Lily's every word and every gesture, carrying a secret that he needed to understand. With each encounter with Lily, resentment was mixed with guilt. He felt unfair for harboring any resentment against her, a woman who was not to blame for her mother's past. And yet he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she was hiding, perhaps unconsciously. Something that had been passed down to her like an unspoken inheritance. A secret that she somehow carried without even knowing it. On a night of almost palpable silence, Lily noticed Nick's distant look and asked, in a cautious tone, if something was bothering him. He hesitated before answering, but ended up diverting the conversation to work, keeping the mystery of his past out of her reach. However, as he spoke, he felt the urgency to tell everything he knew, but the fear of hurting her stopped him. How could he accuse her, even if covertly, for something that possibly not even she herself understood? The internal frustration was unbearable, and Nick felt trapped in a painful dilemma. Lily, in turn, began to notice the subtle change in the way he looked at her. A shadow that hadn't existed before, and that seemed to settle in every time their eyes met. Nick became a stranger, someone she no longer knew how to talk to. And this change, so silent and gradual, hurt her deeply. There was something between them that went beyond the present, a latent pain that she couldn't understand, but that left her confused and increasingly distressed. The situation became untenable the night they were at dinner with Lily's friends. Relaxed and noisy people who seemed to bring out Nick's growing discomfort. He was visibly distant, and Lily felt his built-up tension as if it were something palpable. When the friends casually asked about each other's families, Nick remained silent, and Lily hesitated before mentioning anything about her mother, feeling that any comment might trigger something she didn't yet fully understand. The night ended abruptly, with Nick saying goodbye before everyone else and heading out into the cold air of the street without looking back. Watching him leave, Lily felt a tightness in her chest. She realized more than ever that something dark was hanging over Nick, something she had no idea how to help alleviate. Her steps on the way back home were slow, and each step seemed to echo within her with a feeling of emptiness. When he got home, he picked up his mother's diary and stared at the pages, feeling increasingly distant from all the memories that used to give him comfort. It was as if the past she carried had now turned into a dark and painful enigma. Nick, in turn, walked alone through the streets, immersed in an internal battle. Revelations about the past followed him like a shadow, and he no longer knew where the growing love he felt for Lily ended and the weight of doubts and inherited pain began. He realized that, even if he tried, he could never ignore the connections that linked him to her. But he also didn't know how to deal with the burden that these discoveries brought. Nick could no longer bear the weight of the silence and the growing distance between him and Lily. The information he had discovered and the uncertainty it brought was like a constant burden, haunting every moment they were together. The unspoken words became an invisible but insurmountable wall. Every time he looked at her, he felt torn between the desire to trust and the fear that by sharing what he had discovered. An irremediable truth would come to light, separating them forever. But that day, the decision was made almost without him realizing it. I needed to confront her with the evidence and understand what she knew about her mother's history. If that secret had infiltrated their lives in such an unexpected way, then it was time to face it. The meeting between them was scheduled for a cold night, in the same cafe where they had spoken last time. Lily was waiting for him at a table near the window, watching the busy streets outside. She was apprehensive, feeling a change in the air, a different energy that had hovered over them since their last meeting. Nick entered the cafe with a serious expression and carrying a folder of documents that he seemed to protect as if it contained something valuable, something she would never have imagined. As she saw him approach, Lily noticed the rigidity in his shoulders, the tense face and fixed gaze, and she knew, before he even sat down, that something serious was about to be said. Nick didn't waste time on formalities. As soon as he settled in front of her, he placed the folder on the table, his firm hand indicating that there would be no avoiding what he was about to reveal. "Lily, I need you to see this," he said, without preamble, his voice low, almost cold, but with an intensity that made her heart race. He slowly opened the folder and began to take out the photos and documents he had gathered. There were clippings from old newspapers, copies of photographs he had found in his research, and one specific article, the photo from the exhibition that showed Anne Grant and Margaret Porter side by side, smiling at the camera. Lily frowned as she looked at the images and documents, confused by what she saw. His hands shook slightly as he touched the photographs, trying to absorb every detail. The image of her mother, young and full of life, next to a woman she didn't recognize but knew must be Nick's mother, was a shock. On some level, she knew that her mother had been an artist with a more complex past than she had known. But seeing that image so clear and revealing left her speechless. "That's my mother," she said finally, pointing to Margaret in the photo. "But what does this have to do with us, Nick?" His voice was hesitant, his eyes searching for answers on his face, which maintained an impassive expression. He sighed, looking away for a moment before responding. "Lily, our mothers had a deep connection, a friendship that I didn't even know existed until recently. This photo is from an exhibition where they were together, something that happened shortly before the accident." The word came out with significant weight, and Lily realized the seriousness behind the term. He was looking at her intensely, hoping she would understand the importance of that revelation. "Since I discovered this, I began to understand that there is much more at stake than I imagined." Lily was stunned, trying to process the information. "Wait, Nick, I don't understand what you are implying." "Yes, my mother was friends with yours, but what does that have to do with us now? That was many years ago. Why is this relevant?" He hesitated before answering, knowing that what he was about to say could change everything between them. "Because, Lily, I found out that the accident that took my parents' lives involved your mother in some way. There are mentions of her in the news at the time as a close friend, someone who apparently knew things that perhaps she never told anyone. Don't you understand? This accident, this tragedy that marked my life and yours, seems to be linked to something that both families tried to bury. And now I don't know if I can fully trust you, knowing that you can carry part of this secret." The last sentence hit her like a blow. She blinked, stunned, and looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and pain. "How can you think that of me, Nick? Do you really believe that my mother would have hidden something that could harm yours? Or that I would have any idea of such a secret? I never knew anything. My mother was a good person, someone who loved art and who lived a peaceful life, at least as far as I know." Her voice wavered between indignation and fear that perhaps there was something she didn't know, something Nick might actually be right to suspect. He remained silent for a moment, watching her carefully, trying to gauge the sincerity in her words. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to trust her every word, but the evidence and the resentment he had built up made any possibility of full trust difficult. "Lily, I know this comes as a shock to you," he began, in a softer tone, "but I can't ignore what I found. All the pieces fit together, and it feels like our lives were somehow predestined to intersect. Maybe you don't know anything, but the fact is that my mother's past and yours are intertwined in a way that I can no longer ignore." Lily swallowed hard, her eyes beginning to water as she tried to absorb everything Nick was telling her. Part of her wanted to believe it was just a coincidence, that the friendship between their mothers didn't carry the weight he was implying. But his tense face and the evidence before him were undeniable. "And what do you expect me to do, Nick?" The question came out in a whisper, filled with pain. "Do you want me to apologize for what our mothers experienced? That I accept this guilt that you seem to want to place on me? I don't even know where to begin to understand all of this." He lowered his head, clearly struggling with his own emotions. "I don't want you to apologize, Lily," he replied, his voice filled with suppressed anguish. "I just need to understand, knowing that this is real, that everything I discovered is not a tragic coincidence, but perhaps a story that has a purpose, a meaning, or at least an answer." She looked at him with tenderness and sadness, understanding the pain he carried and how much it consumed him. But she was also injured. The idea that he could believe that she or her mother had had any part in such a devastating tragedy was almost unbearable. "Nick, I'm sorry you're dealing with this, but the truth is, I don't have the answers you want. Everything I know about my mother is in the few memories I have, and perhaps in the scraps of a diary she left behind. I would never have imagined that she had such a deep secret." Nick watched her, a mixture of regret and understanding in his gaze. "Maybe I expected you to know more than you actually do, and I'm sorry I doubted you." He reached out, touching her hand gently, as an attempt to repair what his words had hurt. I just want this to stop tormenting me, Lily. I want to understand what happened to my mother, and maybe the fact that your mother was involved in this made me lose control of my own emotions." Lily held his hand in hers, feeling the warmth and weight of that gesture. "We're dealing with something that belongs in the past, Nick. Something that may never be completely revealed. I don't know what this means for both of us, but if there's a way to stay together without letting this shadow destroy what we're building, then we need to find that way." The silence that followed between them was heavy, but there was also a mutual understanding. A silent promise to try to move forward despite the secrets and unresolved pain. They knew that no matter what they discovered in the future, their present now depended on trust and vulnerability, on facing doubts without letting them push them away. Lily gently removed her hand and, in an almost shy gesture, picked up one of the photos. Looking at her mother's smiling faces, she thought about everything she didn't know, everything that might never be revealed, but also everything she and Nick could still build from that moment on, if they chose to let the past rest and focus on something that strengthened them and not to separate them. The next morning, Lily still felt the weight of Nick's words, the impact they had made echoing in her mind. The implicit accusation, the distrust he had shown in suggesting that her mother could be involved in such a profound tragedy, hit her in a way she couldn't shake. It was as if suddenly her entire past was on trial. The image she had always had of her mother now covered in a fog of suspicion and hurt that Nick had planted. When she woke up, the first thing she felt was the urge not to see him. For the first time since they started building something together, she didn't want to be near him. She felt wronged and betrayed. It wasn't just the pain of discovering that their mothers had shared a secret past. It was the pain of seeing that Nick, someone she was beginning to trust, chose to judge her and her mother without even giving her the benefit of the doubt. She knew he had reasons for wanting to understand the past, but now she understood that her own desire to investigate everything was dragging her to a place she didn't want to be. During breakfast, I looked at the table where they used to sit together, where they shared conversations, where they began to open up their lives to each other. Every detail now seemed to carry a shadow of doubt and sadness. She knew that if she remained close to Nick, she would always be involved in that mystery that he seemed determined to solve, but that left her worn out and hurt. She needed time. She needed to find a space for herself, away from all the complexity he had brought into her life. Made the decision to walk away, Lily picked up the phone and sent him a brief message, avoiding saying more than what was essential. "Nick, I need some time to process all of this. I hope you understand." There was no anger or resentment in the words, just a frankness that showed how exhausted she was and needed distance. She knew he would realize the seriousness of her decision, and that relieved her, but also saddened her. As much as I liked him, I couldn't ignore the pain he had caused. the feeling that he had crossed a line that couldn't be erased. When Nick received the message, he felt as if the air had been knocked from his lungs. I knew something like this could happen. He could see the pain and disappointment on her face during their last conversation. But now, faced with the reality of her separation, the impact was much deeper than he had imagined. He felt empty, as if something essential had been ripped from his life. Lily's presence, always so vibrant and full of life, had become a fundamental part of her daily life. She was a constant presence, a light that unexpectedly illuminated the darkest parts of his life, even if he had never planned for it to happen. Nick tried to work, distracting himself with his daily commitments and tasks that he always carried out efficiently. But he realized that his concentration was compromised. Everything seemed pointless. The silence in his home, which had once brought him peace and a sense of control, was now oppressive, a cold emptiness that he could not bear. Her absence filled every corner, as if her vibrant energy was still there, echoing in every space. He realized that he had always avoided depending on anyone emotionally, that he had always built his life around his independence and autonomy. But now, without Lily, he realized how much she had helped him see the world differently. As the days passed, Nick reflected on what had really led him to push her away. He knew that his obsession with understanding his mother's past had become an almost compulsive need, a desire to find an explanation for the emptiness and loss he had always felt. He wanted answers, yes, but now he was beginning to question whether the search for those answers was actually moving him forward, or just keeping him trapped in endless suffering. He had spent years building walls around his life, keeping away any possibility of real connection, and ironically, the only person who had managed to break through those walls was now the same person he had pushed away with his own hands. On one of the nights when the silence felt overwhelming, Nick found himself in his office, surrounded by documents, photos, and all the evidence he had gathered about his mother and Margaret's past. He looked at those images and texts with a feeling of growing frustration, as if everything that had previously seemed essential to him was now just a bitter reminder that he had lost something even more important: the possibility of being next to someone who genuinely cared about him. The emptiness I felt now seemed greater than any mystery or secret in the past. In the middle of the night, tired and emotionally exhausted, he picked up the phone and wrote a message to Lily, trying to express what he felt. "Lily, I'm so sorry. I let my obsession with the past drive us away. I shouldn't have done that. I understand if you need time, but I want you to know that I'm deeply sorry." He reread the message several times, but each word seemed inadequate, insufficient to express the regret he felt. Eventually, he decided not to send the message. It was too simple an excuse for a pain he knew he had caused her, a pain he himself wouldn't know how to face. He put the phone aside, closed his eyes, and let the guilt that consumed him take over. In the days that followed, Nick began to realize how much Lily's presence had altered his perception of his own life. It was as if, until he met Lily, he was stuck in a state of dormancy, where everything was about routine, control, and the lack of surprises. But with her, every moment felt like a new discovery. She had taught him, even if unintentionally, to see the world differently, to open up to the unexpected, and to accept that not everything could be understood or controlled. And now that she was no longer by his side, the world seemed gray again. Without the brightness and spontaneity that she brought, he wondered if he really needed to let go of his past in order to move forward with her, to win her back and show that he was willing to change. But the idea of abandoning this search also terrified him, as it meant leaving behind the answers he believed he needed. It was a deep conflict, a battle between the desire to resolve the shadows that had always haunted him and the fear that this obsession would deprive him of the future he could have with Lily. One Sunday morning, while walking aimlessly through the city streets, Nick found himself passing by an art gallery. There was a new exhibition, and people came in excitedly, commenting on the works with enthusiasm. He felt drawn to the place, as if there was something inside that he needed to see. Upon entering, he was greeted by a mixture of colors and shapes that enveloped him, bringing him a feeling of peace that he hadn't experienced in a long time. He went from one work to another, observing the details, but it was one painting in particular that caught his attention. It was an abstract canvas, full of bright colors and chaotic lines that, at the same time, formed an inexplicable harmony. He remembered Lily, how she used to see the beauty in chaos, how she could find balance in even the most unpredictable situations. And then, in that moment, something lit up inside him. He realized that, to be with Lily, he would need to accept that not everything needed to be resolved, that perhaps some answers would never come, and that this did not diminish the value of what they were building together. The past was important, yes, but it shouldn't be the anchor that prevented you from living in the present. Upon leaving the gallery, Nick felt renewed. He understood that he would still need to deal with the memories and questions about his mother's, but now he realized that the desire to have all the answers could no longer be the center of his life. With this clarity, I knew I needed to find Lily. I needed to express to her the transformation I was experiencing and try, in some way, to regain the trust I have lost. Still unsure of how to approach her, Nick decided to go to her studio. When he arrived, the space was empty, but he could see the traces of her presence on every canvas, in every brush, in every color she had left behind. He waited for hours, hoping she would show up, but when he realized she wasn't coming, he felt defeated. Her absence in that place, which used to be so full of life, hit him brutally. And it was there, in that space, surrounded by Lily's creations, that Nick finally understood what it meant to miss someone. The emptiness of her absence was a reflection of the very emptiness he had fed for years with his obsession with the past. Lily was the only person who had brought color and meaning to his life, and he had let fear and distrust rob him of that. Now all he had left was the hope that she was willing to give him another chance. Driven by Lily's absence and the need to understand everything he had discovered, Nick made the decision to return to his childhood home, a home he had not visited since his father moved away, trying to leave the painful memories behind. The Grants' old residence remained intact, a large mansion in an isolated neighborhood, surrounded by towering trees and a garden that, although abandoned, still retained traces of its former splendor. The house itself was a monument to the past, a place full of stories, but also of silences, of secrets that, for years, had remained hidden. As he passed through the rusty gates, he felt a sense of melancholy, almost as if the air was thick with the memories he had always avoided. The walls of the house, high and solemn, seemed to watch him, and Nick sort of felt like a child again, fearing what he would find there. He opened the door cautiously, the distinctive creak echoing through the empty hallway. Morning light streamed in through the dusty windows, creating beams of light that shot through the air, illuminating tiny suspended dust particles as if time had stopped. He walked down the main hallway, looking at the walls decorated with family portraits. In every face, he saw the reflection of a story, but all those frozen smiles seemed carried with a weight that he was only now beginning to understand. He climbed the stairs with slow steps to his father's old office. He remembered how that space was a refuge for the reserved man he had raised alone after his mother's death. Someone he had always believed to be unshakable, but who he now saw as a complex person, full of scars that he had never had the courage to examine closely. In the office, Nick began opening drawers, looking through old papers and documents. With each stack of papers turned over, he felt more impatient, a mixture of anxiety and hope that something there could finally clarify the shadows that hung over him and Lily. After a while, he found a small wooden box hidden at the back of one of the lower drawers. His heart sped up when he recognized the box. He remembered seeing it as a child, an object that his mother always kept close by, guarding it with extreme care. With shaking hands, he opened the box. Inside was a small collection of letters, tied with a faded ribbon. Nick pulled out one of the letters, with his mother's careful handwriting on the envelope. When he opened it, the paper, already yellowed and fragile, revealed words that seemed filled with a sadness and guilt that he didn't recognize. "Dear Anne, there are days when I feel like the weight of what I've done will never be light enough to let me sleep peacefully. I know that in many ways I am alienating myself from the people around me, especially you, and I fear this is irreparable. I carry with me a guilt that I may never be able to overcome. All I can say is that if I can ever find a way to right the wrong I made, I'll be willing to do whatever it takes." His mother's words went through Nick like a blade. It was the first time he had seen his mother, Anne, revealing such deep and dark emotions, something he had never imagined. That great guilt seemed immense, wrapped in regret and sadness. He reread the letter several times, trying to interpret every line, every word. His mother, someone he always saw as a figure of tenderness and calm, carried a secret that gnawed at her. Something so deep that it affected not only her, but the people around her. He continued searching for more clues and found another letter, equally filled with regret. "Margaret, my friend, I feel increasingly unable to find peace. The mistake I made seems to grow over time, as if it can never be erased. I know our friendship has always been based on trust, but now I see that I was responsible for breaking that. It's hard to confess, but I need you to know how sorry I am, even if it means losing your presence in my life." When he finished reading, Nick remained motionless, his mind and heart in turmoil. His mother wasn't just referring to a common mistake. Something serious and complex connected her to Margaret, something that seemed to corrode the ties that united them. Now he understood that his obsession with uncovering the past was not a simple search for answers, but a deep need to understand why his mother seemed so marked by guilt and regret. He realized that, deep down, his mother had also suffered from the relationship she had with Margaret, a friendship that had somehow been destroyed by something irreparable. The pain he felt upon discovering these letters was profound, but it was mixed with a strange sense of relief. Finally, he had a concrete clue, something that confirmed what he suspected. His mother's past was, in fact, intertwined by a secret that they had both kept hidden, but that had affected their lives in an indelible way. The letters revealed a vulnerability in his mother that he had never known. A woman who had made a mistake so big that it caused her to distance herself from the people she loved. Nick sat on the office floor, holding the letters as if they were relics, fragments of a life he had never fully understood. He imagined how much his mother would have suffered, how much that guilt could have affected her behavior, her look, her words, and even her death. Everything seemed to take on a new meaning, and he was beginning to understand that, by focusing so much on the past, perhaps he was trying to fill her absence, a gap that, now he realized, might never be completely filled. Still, something remained in his heart, the resentment that Lily, somehow, bore the inheritance of all of this. He felt torn, as if the weight of this secret also belonged to her, even though he knew that wasn't fair. It was as if, in trying to find an answer to the void left by his mother, he had become trapped in the need for someone, even Lily, to share the weight of that past with him. For hours he stayed in that office, lost in memories and assumptions, trying to unravel the depth of the pain his mother had felt and the kind of mistake that had caused her to break off her friendship with Margaret. He felt that somehow, there was a crucial link that still eluded his understanding, a missing piece in the puzzle he had put together with so much effort. And at that moment, he realized that perhaps the only person who could help him fill this gap was Lily, the person he had pushed aside in his eagerness to solve everything alone. With each new reading of the letters, the image he had of his mother transformed, revealing layers of fragility and complexity that he had never imagined. Anne Grant wasn't just the kind, distant mother he remembered. She was a woman with her own fears, with deep secrets and regrets, someone he had probably never really met. And her friendship with Margaret, the intense and enigmatic bond they shared, now seemed to be at the heart of all the tragedy that had shaped their lives. Finally, upon leaving the old house, Nick felt exhausted, as if he had been emptied of all the anger and resentment that had driven him there. Instead, there was only a sense of melancholy, of acceptance of the fact that not all answers would bring the peace he sought. His mother's pain, her mistake, the guilt she carried until the end, it was all part of a past he could never change. Upon returning to the city, he felt the weight of Lily's absence even more acutely. She was the only person who had helped him open up, who had encouraged him to face the chaos and find a way to live with it. She had been his anchor, his connection to a side of himself he had always feared, and now without her, the pain of the past felt unbearable. He knew that if he wanted to try to rebuild what he had lost, he would need to find a way to show Lily that he was willing to leave the past behind, or at least not let it dictate the future they could build together. Arriving back at his apartment, Nick sat in silence, the letter still in his hand, feeling that this secret, the same one that had broken his mother's friendship and that he, in a way, continued to carry, needed to be revealed. Revealed, but not as a burden on Lily, but as a plea for understanding. Days after his visit to his childhood home, Nick decided he could no longer delay the inevitable confrontation. There was something between him and Lily that needed to be resolved, a shared secret that they now had to face together. He sought her out, asking to meet in a quiet, out-of-the-way cafe where they could talk calmly and, he hoped, open space for understanding. His message was brief but sincere, and although Lily was hesitant, she agreed to meet him. As hurt as she was, she felt that she also needed answers, and that only with Nick could she perhaps understand the gaps that the past had left open. That night, Nick arrived early, his eyes fixed on the cafe's entrance as he awaited her arrival. The air was cold, and he rubbed his hands together to contain his nervousness, his mother's old letter tucked away carefully in the pocket of his jacket. When Lily finally entered, he stood up, the tension between them immediately evident. She seemed different, more reserved, as if she had erected an invisible barrier between them to protect herself from any new pain he might cause. They exchanged a formal greeting, a subdued version of the intimacy they usually shared, and sat in silence. Nick took a deep breath before speaking, knowing his words needed to be careful. "Lily, I'm sorry for the way I acted. I know I hurt you, and I'm deeply sorry for that. But I needed you to know that what I discovered about our mother's past isn't something I can ignore. And to be honest, I'm here because I believe you deserve to know what I found." Gently, he removed the letter from his pocket and placed it on the table, offering it to her with a firm but vulnerable look. Lily looked at him, then at the letter. There was a mixture of reluctance and curiosity in his eyes, as if the letter were both a revelation and a threat. He took it carefully, opening the old paper and starting to read. Anne's words, filled with guilt and regret, came as a shock to Lily. Each sentence seemed to weigh on her, each line a silent confession from a woman she had never met, but who now seemed close. Someone who lived the same dilemmas and anguish that Margaret had described in her own diary. Lily felt a tightness in her chest as she continued reading. When she finished, she kept her gaze fixed on the table, absorbing the words that still resonated in her mind. My mother also wrote about regrets," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. She mentioned being estranged from someone important, someone with whom she shared secrets and deep moments. But she never told me why. She always left it veiled, as if it were a shadow she didn't want to show me. Nick watched her intently, his expression softened by the understanding and relief that, finally, they were on the same page, sharing a pain that was neither of theirs, but that they carried as an inheritance. He placed his hand over hers, a gesture he hoped would show support, and to his surprise, she didn't move it away. "I believe that whatever happened between our mothers changed them profoundly," he said, his voice low, almost solemn. "Something that they may never have been able to overcome. And as long as it took me to realize that, I feel like in order to move forward, we need to understand what it was." Lily nodded, her face still marked with uncertainty. "But how? They never said anything. Not to me, not to you. If they wrote about it, it was vague, hiding details, as if they were afraid we would find out." She looked at him, frustration and curiosity evident. "Is there something we can still discover, Nick? Something that can finally help us understand?" Nick hesitated before answering, but Lily's determined look encouraged him. "I thought about it, and while I was at my family's old house, I found some references to an art gallery they used to go to together. Maybe it's a good starting point. This place may have records of events or even exhibitions where they were present. And maybe, if we're lucky, someone will still remember them." Lily was silent for a moment, absorbing the idea. She had her own doubts about revisiting the past, but she knew there was a part of her that wanted, or rather, needed, to know the truth, even if it was painful. "If there's a chance we can find some answer, then I want to try," she said finally, looking directly at him. "As difficult as it is, I think we should do this together." Nick nodded, an invisible weight seeming to lift off his shoulders at those words. As frightening as the idea of confronting the past was, the possibility of doing it alongside her made the path a little less lonely. They decided that the next morning they would visit the gallery and look for any remains that might shed light on the connection between Anne and Margaret. Both knew it was a journey full of uncertainty, but they were determined to face it together, united by the search for answers and the need to close a chapter that still haunted them. The next morning, they set off towards the gallery, where Anne and Margaret's first steps into the world of art were recorded. It was a discreet place, hidden on a busy city street, one of those small galleries that have survived time and change. As they entered, they smelled the canvas and fresh nail polish, an aroma that was familiar to Lily and calmed her somewhat. Nick, on the other hand, was tense, his eyes taking in every detail as if he expected some memory to surface at any moment. They were greeted by an older woman who appeared to be the curator of the place. Lily explained in a cautious voice that they were looking for information about two artists who exhibited there many years ago. The woman nodded, interested, and led them to a small office at the back of the gallery, where she kept files and catalogs of old exhibitions. It was a compact but organized space, with shelves full of labeled folders and boxes full of documents. After a brief search, the curator found a folder marked with the year Anne and Margaret had visited the place. Upon opening it, the three began leafing through event records, photos, and exhibition pamphlets. And then, in the middle of one of the catalogs, they found a black and white photo of the two women, Anne and Margaret, smiling side by side at an exhibition opening, both holding brushes as if they were prepared to paint the world together. Lily felt her heart accelerate when she saw that image, while Nick remained silent, absorbing every detail. "It's funny," the curator commented, looking at the image. "They were always very close, always together at all the exhibitions. I don't think I've ever seen one without the other. But I remember that after a certain point, Margaret withdrew completely, and Anne also stopped expounding. They said there was a disagreement, something that distanced them." Nick and Lily exchanged a look, both wondering what had caused that rupture. The curator continued, leafing through the folder. "I never knew exactly what happened, but I remember hearing that there was a lot of sadness involved, as if they had gone through something that marked them forever." Lily felt a pang of pain as she imagined her mother experiencing this kind of sadness, a sadness she had never been able to fully understand. He thought about the diary entries, the sentences that had always seemed so cryptic and were now starting to make sense. It was as if finally every piece of the past was coming together, forming a clearer picture of what Anne and Margaret had experienced. Nick, feeling his heart racing, thanked the curator and, together with Lily, returned to the main part of the gallery where the most recent works were on display. Both were silent for a few moments, absorbing the weight of the information. There was a strange melancholy in realizing that their mothers carried secrets so deep, regrets so great, that they ended up pushing them away forever. Finally, Nick broke the silence, speaking quietly, as if confessing something to himself. "I guess all I wanted was to understand why this happened. Why did my mother, a person I always saw as calm and loving, hide so much from me? Now I realize that we may never fully understand, but for some reason I feel like it got us here. And perhaps it is our turn to decide how we want to deal with this legacy of pain and secrets." Lily nodded, her eyes watering as she thought about her mother, what she would have sacrificed or lost by carrying that secret. "Maybe it's not about finding all the answers, Nick. Maybe it's about accepting that they lived what they lived, that they did the best they could, but we can choose differently." The silence that followed between them was different this time. There was no longer the tension of doubts or the weight of distrust. Now there was a kind of peace, a shared understanding that, as painful as it was, they were not doomed to repeat the mistakes of their mother's past. Back at Nick's apartment, the silence between him and Lily was deep but charged with new understanding. The latest discoveries at the gallery had been an important step, but they knew the picture was far from complete. Their mother's past still hung over them, like a riddle that resisted solution, but somehow guided them to an inescapable truth. Sitting side by side, they analyzed the documents and letters that Nick had found spread across the coffee table. Lily caressed the yellowed paper of Anne's letter, while Nick again leafed through Margaret's diary that she had brought with her. Every line, every excerpt revealed a new layer of regret, guilt and sadness. Until then, their mother's words had seemed mysterious, but now, with a little more understanding, they took on more definite contours, as if, little by little, Anne and Margaret were telling them, hesitantly, what really happened. It was Nick who finally broke the silence. "I think what surprises me most is the depth of guilt my mother carried," he said, almost in a whisper, his eyes fixed on the letter. "She speaks as if she had made an unforgivable mistake, something that alienated her from everyone, including me and my father." Lily, still lost in thought, nodded. "My mother too," she said, her tone soft and sad. "But what could have been so serious as to destroy their friendship? I always imagined my mother as someone who lived with integrity, who loved art and life simply. But now I wonder what kind of weight she was carrying and never told me." Before they could reflect further, Lily's phone vibrated in her purse, and she, surprised, answered it when she saw her aunt's name, Rosa. Rosa was Margaret's older sister and her only remaining close relative. Someone who, although she wasn't around much during Lily's childhood, still had memories of her mother's youth. "Lily, darling, I'm sorry to call so late," Rose said, in an urgent tone. "But I've thought a lot about what you asked me about your mother, and there's something you need to know. Something that might help answer the questions you have about her past, and about Anne." Lily gripped the phone tighter, her heart racing when she heard Anne's name. She looked at Nick, who was watching her in silent expectation, and nodded, signaling for him to listen too. "What can you tell me, Aunt Rosa?" Lily asked, her voice shaking. Rosa's voice became quieter, almost as if she were afraid to speak. "There was a time, before the accident, when Margaret started getting involved in investing, something that, at the time, seemed like a great opportunity. An influential man convinced her to invest some of her money and, from what I understand, even suggested that she encourage Anne to participate as well. They were very close and wanted to build something together, but the details are vague to me. I just know that Margaret blindly trusted this man. She thought it would be a way to guarantee your future." Lily and Nick exchanged a look. It was a turn of events that neither of them expected. "But something went wrong, didn't it?" Lily questioned, feeling a shiver of anticipation. "Horribly wrong," confirmed Rosa, with a heavy sigh. "This man was a dishonest investor. He used their money to cover debts and support himself. When his scheme collapsed, they lost almost everything they had. Margaret was devastated, feeling responsible. But Anne was even more affected. The Grant family's financial situation became very serious, and it almost destroyed her marriage." There was a pause, and Lily realized that her aunt was hesitant to say more. "Aunt Rosa, please. This is very important for us. What else do you know?" he insisted, trying to contain his distress. "The last time I saw Margaret before the accident, she was completely devastated, feeling like she had ruined her friend's life. I don't know the exact details, but there was a very serious fight between her and Anne. Anne was angry, but also hurt. She blamed Margaret for the situation. I thought it was something that would be resolved, but you know what happened next. The accident. Margaret never got over it, and I don't think she ever forgave herself." Lily felt teary-eyed when she heard those words. He looked at Nick, who was taking in every word with an expression of shock. The accident that took Anne's life and almost ruined Nick's family was in part the result of a chain of events triggered by a desperate decision by Margaret, an attempt to provide a better future for everyone that ended up destroying everything. Nick closed his eyes for a moment, processing the weight of the revelation. When he opened his eyes again, he saw the pain and regret written on Lily's face. She reached out to him in a gesture of silent empathy. As much as he wanted to feel angry, that anger no longer made sense. It was as if the story was finally complete, revealing that both families had been victims of a sequence of decisions, regrets and tragedies that no one could have predicted. "Aunt Rosa," said Lily, her voice low and shaky, "why didn't you ever tell me this before?" Rosa's response was filled with regret. "I thought you would never need to know, Lily. Margaret did her best to protect you from that past, and maybe I made the mistake of thinking the past would stay buried forever." Lily said goodbye to her aunt with a thank you and hung up, remaining silent as she and Nick absorbed the truth. They felt in a way like characters who had unraveled the end of a mystery, but who now needed to deal with the void left by the answer. Nick finally broke the silence. "So, That was it. My mother found herself betrayed, and the financial situation dragged us into a crisis from which she was never able to escape. And Margaret, she tried to make amends for what she did. But I think the burden was too much for her. Lily nodded, looking down, feeling a deep guilt, even though she knew none of it was her personal fault. It's strange, Nick. We've spent so long trying to figure out what happened, but now that we know, there's no relief, only sadness. Our mothers were good people who made bad choices, but who also paid a very high price for it. Nick shook her hand, a gesture that conveyed mutual understanding. Maybe, Lily, this is our chance to do something different, of not allowing the past to define them, and for these tragic decisions to destroy more than they have already destroyed. We can honor them without bearing their guilt. Lily looked at him, and for a brief moment, she felt that the weight they were both carrying was finally starting to lift. The truth, although painful, was also an opportunity for them to rebuild what their mother's past had almost destroyed. Nick, I'd like to do something for them, said Lily in a soft, determined tone. Maybe an exhibition, a last tribute to their lives, to the friendship they had before everything fell apart. I think it's the best way to end this story, and remember that, despite everything, there was love and beauty in what they built together. He nodded, a faint smile appearing on his lips. I think it's a great idea. Our mothers deserve to be remembered for what was good, not just what went wrong. They deserve one last chance to be together, even if it's through us. The decision was made. That exhibition would be a tribute to Margaret and Anne, a way of showing that, despite their mistakes, they were still women who loved, dreamed, and fought. At Lily's side, Nick felt, for the first time, that perhaps the pain and guilt could be turned into something beautiful, something that would give new meaning to their own lives. And hand in hand, they began to envision a future in which they could finally live free from the shadows of the past. In the days following the discovery, Lily felt as if she were carrying an unbearable weight, knowing that the tragedy that had shattered Nick's life was in some way a consequence of her mother's choices. Filled her with devastating guilt. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Nick's face, the conflicting emotions he tried to hide, and a sadness that seemed to never end. She felt unable to look at him without being consumed by shame, and the feeling that somehow she was part of that pain, even if involuntarily. Nick, on the other hand, watched Lily's behavior with attention and growing concern. He noticed the subtle changes. Her gaze avoided his. Her voice became quieter with each encounter, and in the quiet moments, she seemed absent, lost in a sea of thoughts that he couldn't reach. He knew that everything they had discovered about their mothers was painful, but he didn't understand why it seemed to be creating a rift between them. Nick felt that, after everything they had experienced and discovered together, the last thing he wanted was to lose her. One night they had met to talk. Nick finally decided to confront her about the change in her behavior. They were sitting on a park bench, the cool night air washing over them as the city lights illuminated their faces. Lily was silent, her eyes fixed on the floor, when Nick broke the silence. "Lily," he began, his voice soft but firm, "ever since we found out all about our mothers, you seem distant. I see how you avoid looking me in the eye, as if you are carrying a burden that you don't share with me. What is happening? Why are you moving away?" Lily took a deep breath, the words weighing heavily on her mind. She wanted to tell him the truth, but the fear of hurting him even more paralyzed her. After a long silence, she looked up and looked at him, finally letting him see the guilt she was trying to hide. "Nick, I don't know if I can stay close to you, knowing that my mother, that this all started with her choices, knowing that the suffering you went through is in part her fault, and indirectly my fault too. I know I didn't do anything directly, but that feeling won't leave my head." Nick listened to her carefully, trying to absorb what she was saying. There was genuine pain in her eyes, something that touched him deeply, but at the same time, he was beginning to realize that perhaps it was time to leave those pains behind. When he saw how hurt she was, he realized he needed to be the anchor at that moment. He took her hands in his and looked at her with a firm gaze, determined to make her understand what he had begun to realize. "Lily," he said, his voice low and deep, "there is nothing you should blame yourself for. We both know that our parents made choices that ended up affecting us. Yes, But that's not your fault. I've already blamed myself. I felt angry, and I know that all of this weighs heavily. But if I've learned anything from everything we've been through, it's that the love I feel for you is not tied to the past. You are no more responsible for your mother's actions than I am for my father's. She tried to look away, but he held her face gently, keeping her gaze locked on his. You are the person I want to build a future with. And now, more than ever, I realize that letting the past keep us away is precisely what I don't want. Our parents had their lives. They made choices, but we still have the chance to do things differently. His words touched her deeply, and Lily felt relief, albeit tentative, begin to fill the gaps in her guilt. However, the weight she carried was still immense, and words could not completely erase the shadow she felt over herself. But Nick, she murmured, her voice breaking, what if deep down this hurt, this pain, never goes away? What if at any moment you start to see me as part of that pain? He shook his head resolutely. No, Lily, I don't see you as part of the pain. When I look at you, I see everything that is good, which makes me want to move forward. I feel that, by your side, I can deal with everything that the past has brought, because you show me that love can be stronger than any shadow it has left. I know it seems hard, but I want to try. I want to give us this chance. Lily watched his face, each word resonating in her heart like a promise she desperately wanted to accept. Still, something inside her hesitated. A part of her that feared that that past would always be between them, that the shadows of their mother's choices could, one day, emerge and destroy what they were building. She knew that Nick loved her, and hearing the determination in his words, she was tempted to believe that he would really be able to put the past behind him, but the doubt persisted. I want this too, Nick, she whispered, her voice barely perceptible. I want very much, but it's like, part of me is still afraid. I saw how much you suffered, and I don't know if I can be a constant reminder of that suffering, even if indirectly. Nick gripped her hands more firmly, moving closer until their faces were mere inches from each other. Lily, we are stronger than this. What happened between our mothers belongs to them, but we have the chance to rebuild everything in ways they may never have been able to. And if there's anything I've learned from this journey, it's that their stories don't have to dictate ours. He paused, letting his words reach her completely. Loving you is a choice I make consciously and freely, and I want it to be the same for you. The pain of the past will always be there, but it doesn't need to be greater than what we can build. I love you, Lily, and I'm willing to face any shadow by your side, as long as you let me do it. His words, spoken with such sincerity, made Lily feel a wave of emotion that she could no longer hold back. He felt that Nick wasn't just offering his love, he offered her a chance at redemption, to leave the past where it belonged and allow them to create something new, something free from the constraints and guilt of their mothers. For the first time, she began to feel that perhaps she could truly believe that her love was stronger than any pain. Caught up in a whirlwind of emotions, Lily felt tears streaming down her face as Nick hugged her tightly, as if he feared that by letting go, she might slide back into the abyss of guilt and regret. She cried on his shoulder, letting go of some of the anguish she had held, and Nick held her in silence, giving her the security she needed at that moment. After some time, she finally calmed down, allowing herself to relax in his arms, feeling that maybe, by Nick's side, she could face anything. As they released their hug, Nick watched her tenderly, wiping her tears with his thumb. We're in this together, Lily. I won't let anything keep us apart. Let's honor what our mothers lived, but let's do it by living our own lives, building a future that is ours, without the shadow of the past. Lily nodded, finally feeling his strength beginning to invade her heart, dispelling some of her doubts. I felt that with Nick, maybe it really would be possible to overcome everything. They spent the rest of the night there, side by side, talking about what they could build together, the possibilities that opened up now that they had decided that their love would be stronger than the pain of the past. In the following weeks, both dedicated themselves to preparations for the exhibition they had planned in honor of their mothers. They worked together, side by side, carefully selecting the works that best represented the love of art that Anne and Margaret shared, but also the complexity of their lives, the regret and the desire for redemption that in some way had brought them together forever. As the exposition took shape, Nick and Lily felt the weight of guilt and pain ease into something lighter, as if the memory of their mothers could finally rest. On opening day, the gallery's small hall was filled with friends and acquaintances, people who came to see Anne and Margaret's works and to celebrate their beauty and talent. Watching the screens side by side, Lily and Nick realized that, despite the tragedies, their mothers had left a valuable legacy, something that, even amid pain and guilt, allowed them to live with intensity. The love Margaret and Anne shared for art was now passed on, transformed into a tribute that not only healed, but showed that love could be rebuilt, even over the rubble of difficult memories. Side by side, hand in hand, Lily and Nick observed the works on display, feeling that they had finally reached the end of one journey and the beginning of another, where they could build a new story. A story of love, strength, and redemption, which belonged only to them. That night, Nick and Lily arranged to meet at the gallery in the same place where they had opened the exhibition in honor of Anne and Margaret. The idea was that this exhibition symbolized the end of the weight they both carried, an end to the painful memories and regrets that belonged to their mother's past. But as he walked to the gallery, Nick felt the weight of everything that still hung over him, as if the forgiveness he was trying to offer Lily was something he still couldn't fully embrace. Upon entering the gallery, the space was empty and silent, the low lights illuminating the works they had chosen so carefully. In the center of the room, among the canvases, stood Lily, looking thoughtfully at one of her mother's paintings. When he heard Nick's footsteps, he turned around with a mixture of sadness and fear in his eyes. Both knew that this meeting was not just about admiring the works. They were there to face the last barrier that stood between them. Nick approached slowly, his gaze fixed on hers. "Lily," he began, in a tone that conveyed the tension built up over the past few days. "I wanted to believe that the exposure and everything we did together here would be enough to free us from what happened, but there is something that still stops me from moving forward." Lily remained silent, her heart sinking as she listened to his words. I knew exactly what he was referring to, because I felt the same way. Their past was so intertwined with hurt and trauma that even with the love they shared, it seemed impossible to simply forgive and forget. She took a deep breath before responding, her voice filled with silent pain. "I feel that way too, Nick. As much as I want to leave all of this behind, I still carry a guilt that I can't ignore. I know I wasn't the one who caused the pain you and your family experienced, but the idea that my mother had a role in all of this is something that still weighs on me. And I see in your eyes that even though you say you forgive me, part of you still carries that hurt." He looked away, staring at one of the paintings with a dark expression. "Lily, I really want to forgive. I want to believe that what we feel is stronger than all of this. But there are moments when, even without wanting to, the memories come back and I feel anger, helplessness. It's as if a part of me is still stuck in the past, in what happened to my mother." She felt a lump form in her throat, a pain that she had been trying to suppress for a long time. "I understand. I also feel this anger, this helplessness at not being able to change the past. What do we do with this now, Nick? How do we move forward knowing that what unites us also hurts us?" Nick sighed, shaking his head. "That's what I don't know. I thought that perhaps with time, the wounds would heal, that our history would erase the old hurts. But it seems like every time we try to move forward, the past comes back to remind us where we came from. It's as if we were always on the edge of an abyss." Lily looked away, trying to hold back the tears. She had imagined this moment so many times, the moment when finally they could face everything and decide to move forward together, leaving the past behind. But now, here, under the gallery lights, with their mother's paintings watching them like silent witnesses, it seemed impossible to ignore the depth of the hurt that still separated them. "Maybe," she said hesitantly, "maybe the truth is that the love we have is not enough to heal all of this. Perhaps what happened between our mothers left such a deep mark that, no matter how hard we try, we will never be able to erase it completely." He looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the same sadness she felt. "And what do you suggest, Lily? That we leave everything we built? That we pretend none of this happened and move on, everyone for themselves?" The idea hurt him deeply, but he knew that, on some level, It might be the only way they could both find peace. Lily hesitated, feeling torn inside. I don't want to lose you, Nick, but I also don't want you to carry this pain every time you look at me. You deserve someone who brings you peace, not bitter memories. And maybe if we walk away, we can finally find that peace. Apart, her words pierced Nick's heart, and he felt a wave of despair wash over him. I don't want this, Lily, he said, his voice cracking with emotion. I don't want to lose you, and I don't want what happened in the past to control our future. As much as it hurts, I know I love you, and I don't know if I'm ready to give that up. She swallowed hard, feeling torn between the desire to stay and the need to let him go. So, what do we do, Nick? Are we still together? Even if it hurts us? Even if the past continues to haunt us? He stared at her, searching for an answer that even he didn't know he had. There was love between them. A love that had been born in the midst of pain, but now seemed to be on the verge of a definitive choice. Nick wanted to believe that that love could somehow overcome everything, but he also knew that the weight of the past was relentless, and that insisting could mean prolonging the suffering of both. Finally, he took a deep breath, summoning the courage to say the words he never thought he would need to say. Maybe you're right, Lily. Maybe what we feel for each other isn't enough to erase everything that happened. But still, I think we deserve a chance to try. One last attempt to see if we can find a way to live with the past without letting it define who we are. Lily was silent, absorbing his words. Deep down, she knew Nick was offering an opportunity, a chance to fight for what they felt, even if it was risky. She wanted to accept, wanted to believe that their love was strong enough, but the doubt continued to gnaw at her. She felt guilty, as if she were dragging Nick into endless pain. But at the same time, she didn't want to lose the only love that had truly touched her soul. After a long moment of hesitation, Lily reached out and took Nick's hand, intertwining her fingers with his. Maybe we can try. Maybe together we can find a way to make love stronger than pain. Nick squeezed her hand, feeling relief mixed with a twinge of uncertainty. I knew that the decision to stay together was not a happy ending, but rather a complicated beginning. They were willing to face the shadows their mothers had left behind, but aware that the journey would be difficult. They remained silent, hands intertwined, absorbing the weight of the choice they had just made. There, in the middle of the gallery that held the last vestiges of Anne and Margaret's stories, Nick and Lily made a silent promise that they would try, despite everything, to rebuild something that was just theirs. The morning after their meeting at the gallery, Lily woke up with a feeling of lightness she hadn't felt in a long time. There was something about the decision to try, despite all the uncertainties, that brought him a kind of peace. However, this peace was fragile, built on layers of doubts and reflections that she knew she would need to face with courage. As he prepared for the day, his mind wandered through the memories of the last few weeks, the revelations, the heartaches, and most importantly, the weight of a past that seemed to insist on keeping them trapped. As he looked at his reflection in the mirror, he felt an urgency to question the guilt he had carried. Since discovering his mother's role in the events that had affected Nick, as much as she loved her mother and understood that her choices had been made in moments of desperation and naivety, Lily was beginning to realize that the burden she had taken on as her own should not have belonged to her. She had absorbed the guilt in order to keep her mother's memory alive in a dignified way, but now she realized that carrying her mother's mistakes was like building her own life on top of a shadow. That morning, walking through the city towards the gallery, Lily allowed herself to reflect on the secrets of the past. Her every step seemed to echo with a weight of responsibility she never consciously chose to carry. He thought about how his mother, in trying to protect her family and guarantee a future for everyone, had ended up getting involved in something much bigger than she could handle. Margaret had become the victim of a chain of events beyond her control. And now, years later, Lily found herself caught up in the same plot, as if her own life was being defined by someone else's decisions. As he walked, he felt a wave of determination rise within him. If you really wanted to move forward with Nick and build something true alongside him, you knew you would need to free yourself from the weight of blame that wasn't yours. Lily understood that there would only be a future for the two of them if she stopped seeing her identity tied to Margaret's mistakes. If she and Nick wanted a life together, they needed to find a way to live as they were, without their mother's decisions defining them. Nick, in turn, was also immersed in intense reflections. In the solitude of his apartment, he wondered why it had always been so difficult for him to let go of the shadows of the past. He had grown up surrounded by silence, half-truths, and unanswered questions, and therefore, he had always sought explanations for everything. This desire to understand, to delve into every detail, was what had motivated him to discover the complete story between his mother and Margaret. But it was also what had kept him away from Lily, imposing barriers that even he didn't know if he could break down. As he thought, he realized that his entire life had been an endless search for control. His mother's past, the tragedy that had shaken his family, had become elements that he tried to understand to the limit, as if, by finding each piece, it was possible to make sense of the pain he felt. But now, with Lily in his life, he was beginning to see that that control was illusory. As much as I understood what happened, there was nothing that could change the facts or mitigate the losses. Understanding this was painful, but at the same time, freeing. He didn't need to live stuck in the past to ensure that it didn't hurt him anymore. In a moment of clarity, Nick realized that all the time he had spent obsessing over unraveling the past, he had neglected the present. Lily had become the person who, without him realizing it, had helped him live in the now. To step out of his comfort zone and accept that happiness lay in the experiences they shared, in the small joys and moments of genuine connection. What he felt for her was something that transcended logic and shadows, a love that went beyond any inherited hurt. But to live this love fully, he knew he would need to abandon the resentment, the desire for revenge that he had at some point had against Margaret, and that, consequently, had kept him distant from Lily. Sitting in the living room of his apartment, he looked at his mother's letters for the last time. The words filled with regret and sadness, which he had previously read with anger and pain, now seemed to be a reflection of something that he was finally able to forgive. He realized that although Anne and Margaret's past was a part of his story, he didn't need to let it guide his every decision. He got up, walked to the window, and felt surprised by an unprecedented lightness, as if he were, for the first time, really ready to live his own life. Without thinking twice, Nick picked up the phone and called Lily. Her voice when she answered sounded familiar and comforting, but he realized there was an unresolved tension, as if they were both waiting to hear the right words. "Lily," he began, his tone softer and more sincere than he had used before. "We need to talk. I think after everything we've been through, I finally understand what I need to do to move forward, and what we need to do together if we want this to work." Lily remained silent for a moment, processing his words, and then responded with a mix of curiosity and hope. "I also feel like we need to have this conversation. I've been reflecting a lot, and I think now I'm ready to really face what needs to be faced." They agreed to meet that same night, and when Lily arrived at Nick's apartment, she found him calmer, his expression lighter than before. She knew something in him had changed, and it made her feel more comfortable, like she was ready to face that last conversation. They sat side by side on the couch, and Nick began to speak, his voice low and calm. "Lily, I know everything we discovered about our mothers was difficult, but as much as guilt and pain have bound us, I don't want them to continue to define who we are. I love you for who you are, not for what our mothers did or didn't do. I spent too much of my life obsessing about the past, trying to find a reason for what happened. And now I realize that to be happy, I need to leave it behind." She listened to him, her eyes brimming with emotion. "I feel the same way too, Nick. I spent my whole life trying to understand my mother, trying to be someone who honored her memory. But now I see that I lost myself in that process. I carried the weight of her mistakes as if they were my own. But I realized that this should never have been my fault. It was her story, and I need one that is mine. We need one that's ours." Nick took her hand, squeezing it gently. "So how about we let the past rest? We can continue to honor their memory, but in a way that doesn't imprison us. We don't need to carry what they carried. We have the right to live a light life, without the shadows that their choices left." Lily nodded, a shy smile appearing on her face. "I want this, Nick. I want us to build something of our own, free from the constraints of the past. I want us to be able to look at each other and see just what we have here now without the weight of what once was. They sat in silence, absorbing the depth of the commitment they had just made. It was a promise of love, yes, but also a promise of freedom. They understood that the scars of the past would always be present, but instead of hurting them, they could only serve as reminders of everything they had overcome together. That night, they felt like they were finally ready to start something new. As Nick hugged her, Lily closed her eyes, allowing herself to imagine the future. A future where they could be free, where they could love without the limitations that the past had imposed. In the silence of the apartment, they knew that the journey would not be easy, that the path would still be full of challenges. But now, for the first time, they were sure that they would face them together. And with this certainty, they felt that they had finally found true forgiveness, not only for what had happened between their mothers, but mainly for everything they had carried over the years. Nick and Lily decided, in a meaningful conversation, that they needed to visit the scene of the accident, the place where the fates of the two families became irreversibly and painfully intertwined. It wasn't an easy decision for either of them, but there was something in the silence between them that made them understand that, in order to definitively leave the past behind, they would need to face that place, as if only there they could close the cycle. The accident that had taken Anne's life and transformed Margaret was the event that had imbued their own lives with an old pain, almost impossible to erase. The morning of the meeting, Lily felt anxious and introspective. There was something unsettling about revisiting the tragedy she knew only in fragments. She imagined what Nick felt. While she only knew the story from her aunt's stories, he had been there, a small child, traumatized by the memories and invisible scars he carried to this day. There was an intensity in Nick that she now understood was the result of the loss and abandonment he had suffered, of an internal struggle to fill the void left by his mother and to understand the inexplicable. They traveled in silence, side by side in Nick's car. He held the steering wheel tightly, eyes fixed on the road, while Lily looked out the window, deep in thought. With each kilometer they passed, the weight of that journey increased, as if they were entering deeper into the heart of the past. When they arrived, they parked in a deserted area on the side of the road, where time seemed to have stopped. The place still had traces of the past, but now it was marked by abandonment and oblivion, with tall trees and shadows that covered the winding road. Once out of the car, Nick and Lily walked in silence down the road to the exact location of the accident. Nick felt his heart quicken and anguish take over him when he came across the marks that were still visible on the curve of the road, like scars from the past. He stopped, looking around, taking in every detail. He closed his eyes for a moment, and the image of his mother, so vivid in his memory, seemed to resurface in that place. There was a deep sadness in reliving those moments, but at the same time, he felt he needed to confront them. Lily stood beside him, not saying a word, but her presence brought silent comfort. She felt the weight of the story that she had never experienced directly, but that seemed to be etched in the air around them, an old pain that still remained in place. Without realizing it, he reached out and grabbed Nick's hand, squeezing him tightly, as if he was giving him the security he needed to face the past. After a long moment of silence, Nick spoke, his voice low and hesitant, as if he was struggling to find the right words. "I was so little when all this happened," he began, his voice shaking. "I didn't understand what it meant to lose someone at that time. I just knew that my mother would never come back. But over the years, that absence turned into something immense, into questions and guilt that I could never answer or dispel. I always wanted to understand, but at the same time, I felt an anger that I never knew how to control." Lily watched him, feeling his every word sink into her heart. She knew there was nothing she could really say to ease that pain, but at least he wasn't alone. "Nick," she said, her voice soft, "you don't have to carry this pain alone. I know the past is a deep wound, but I think it will only heal if you allow that anger to go away." Nick turned to her, his gaze full of emotion. "I want to put this behind us, Lily. I want to forget the guilt, forget the resentment, but at the same time, part of me still feels stuck in this pain. It's like I'm always trying to protect what's left of me, but in reality, I'm just prolonging the suffering." Lily took a step closer to him, touching his face tenderly. "You're not alone, Nick. I am here. We're here, And I think maybe now is the time to forgive not only our mothers, but ourselves for everything we've been through." Nick nodded slowly, and together they both knelt on the rough ground of the road, where the mark of the accident was still visible. He looked at Lily, and in that moment, he felt her presence as something that sustained him, something that gave him courage to face what he feared most. He closed his eyes and in a low voice, almost as if it were a prayer, he began to speak. "I forgive you, Mother. I forgive you for everything that happened, for all the mistakes you made that I could never fully understand. I know that you tried, that you did the best you could, and now I understand that I too need to free myself from this weight." His voice broke, and he allowed himself to cry, the tears finally releasing the pain he had kept bottled up for so long. Lily, touched by Nick's vulnerability, did the same. With her eyes closed and her voice trembling, she whispered, "I forgive you, Mother. I know you tried to protect our family, but now I understand that this burden does not belong to me. I will live for myself, no longer because of what you lived. I love you, and I want you to rest in peace." For long minutes, they remained kneeling there, side by side, their voices mixing with the gentle wind that seemed to bless them with silent relief. The emotional burden was intense, but at the same time, they felt lighter, as if finally the invisible chains that tied them to the past had been broken. They hugged each other, seeking comfort in each other, letting the weight of the pain slowly dissipate. Nick pulled away slightly, still holding Lily by the shoulders, his eyes now free of the shadow of bitterness he had always carried. "Thank you, Lily," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for being with me, for staying by my side throughout this process. I couldn't have done this without you." She smiled, her eyes shining with tears, but filled with genuine happiness. "I'll always be here, Nick. We are in this together, and nothing in the past can change how we feel about each other. Let's carry what they left us, but in a way that doesn't hurt us anymore." Still hugging each other, they looked at the horizon, which now seemed much brighter and more welcoming. There, in the place where so many painful memories had been born, they made the decision to build new memories, lighter, happier, and free from the guilt that had oppressed them so much. They came out stronger, feeling that they had finally left the past where it belonged. Back in the car, as Nick drove, they both remained silent, but it was a different silence. A silence filled with a serenity they hadn't experienced in a long time. It was as if the road that stretched ahead represented the freedom that they had both achieved, the possibility of living in the present without the shadows of what their mothers had experienced. When they arrived back in the city, the world seemed renewed. The streetlights, the movement of people, the cool night air, everything seemed more vibrant, more full of promise. When Nick parked the car, he turned to Lily and watched her with a tender gaze, his heart filled with a feeling that was now free to grow. "Lily, let's start again," he said, with a soft smile. "Let's build our own story, without blame, without regrets. Let's allow ourselves to be happy." She smiled back, a sincere joy radiating from her face. "Yes, Nick, that's exactly what I want. Let's live our lives, our way, honoring what our mothers meant to us, but letting our love be greater than any memory." They kissed, a kiss full of promise and certainty, a true beginning to the story they both deserved. It was the end of a cycle, but also the beginning of a journey together, where it could finally be just them. Nick and Lily, ready to face the future wherever it took them. In the months following their final confrontation at the crash site, Nick and Lily truly began to embark on a path of reconstruction and healing. Every day together turned into an opportunity to explore the world without the shadows that once weighed them down. The decision to leave the past where it belonged, with all the memories and pain it carried, was a choice that brought a freedom that they were both only now beginning to understand. Their lives gained a new rhythm, guided by an unprecedented lightness. Instead of living under the constant tension of what was, they began to focus on what they could build. At first, this lightness seemed almost strange, as if living without guilt was something they needed to learn. But as the days passed, the fear dissipated, and the idea of a future together became more and more concrete. They now had a second chance, and they were determined to take advantage of it. Shortly after reuniting at the scene of the accident, Nick made an important and delicate decision. He sold the old family home, which had long remained empty, a symbol of difficult memories and lost moments. That house, with its imposing walls and shadowy hallways, had been a place of pain and longing, but now he knew it was time to let it go. Together with Lily, he decided to transform the sale proceeds into an investment that meant a new beginning. They decided to open a gallery of their own, a space where they could display not only the works that belonged to Anne and Margaret's legacy, but also new artists and eventually Lily's own work, who returned to painting with renewed passion. The gallery became a refuge for both of them, a place that represented what really mattered to them. No longer the weight of past memories, but the freedom to build something together, full of beauty, creativity, and meaning. With each day they spent organizing their new space, choosing pieces, taking care of the details. Nick and Lily felt like they were cementing a solid future, one that reflected how they felt about each other. One morning, as Lily finished hanging a new series of paintings in the gallery, Nick watched her, fascinated by the delicacy and dedication she put into each gesture. She moved with grace and concentration, her eyes sparkling as she adjusted each frame to perfection. He approached her slowly, wrapping her in a hug from behind. Lily smiled, closing her eyes and enjoying the feeling of security she felt next to him. "You know I could spend the rest of my life doing this, don't you?" she said in a soft tone, turning to face him. "Organizing exhibitions, discovering new artists. It's as if, finally, I found something that makes sense to me." Nick smiled, his eyes full of tenderness. "That's exactly what I wanted for us, Lily. A place where we can build something of our own, where the past is not a burden, but a part of who we are. A part that brought us here, but that no longer defines us." She nodded, stroking his face, feeling how true that statement was. They had overcome so much together, and now everything seemed simpler, more real. For Nick, seeing Lily fall in love with art again was a kind of silent healing. Not only had she rediscovered the joy of creating, she also inspired him to be a better version of himself. For the first time in a long time, he could live without the constant weight of guilt or anger, without the need to understand every detail of the past to feel at peace. The official opening of the gallery was a special moment. Friends, family, and new acquaintances showed up to honor the couple and see what they had created. The gallery was full of art and emotion. There was a special exhibition in honor of Anne and Margaret, with a section dedicated to some of the last works they had produced. But instead of being seen as a legacy marked by pain, the works were now celebrated as part of an artistic heritage, a reflection of the intense lives they both led, with all their imperfections and complexities. Walking through the gallery that evening, Nick and Lily found themselves in a corner, watching the flow of people admiring the works. Lily, excited, grabbed Nick's hand and pulled him closer. "Can you believe we're here, Nick? After all, it feels like a dream." He smiled, shaking her hand. "It's more than a dream. It is proof that we are capable of living beyond what we believed possible. Every step we've taken so far has been to build something that isn't marked by the past. And now, we have the future before us." She hugged him tightly, feeling the warmth and love that filled her so much. In that moment, everything felt right, as if every difficult decision, every moment of pain, had somehow led them to that moment. It was a moment of silent victory, of overcoming, and above all, of hope. Over time, the gallery became a meeting point for other artists and art lovers, a space where each piece brought with it a story, a passion, a dream. Lily, inspired by the energy that circulated there, began to paint more than ever. His works began to reflect the journey he had lived with Nick, expressing in colors and shapes the transformation and healing they had achieved together. Each brushstroke was a declaration of freedom, a testimony that it was possible to be reborn and leave old wounds behind. Nick, in turn, found the gallery not just a business, but a purpose. He was dedicated to supporting young artists, offering them the kind of opportunities his mother never had. There was a poetic irony to it, a kind of redemption in helping others accomplish what Anne, in her life, had never fully achieved. And in doing so, he felt he was honoring her memory in a way that was real and lasting. But that didn't tie him down. He was no longer tied to what had been lost, but rather motivated by what he was building. Months turned into years, and Nick and Lily's relationship deepened in ways neither of them imagined. There were no more secrets between them, no hidden shadows. They were free to love and be loved, without fear, without guilt, and with the certainty that, together, they had overcome what for many would have been insurmountable. Their story, which had begun with so much uncertainty and hurt, had transformed into a journey of love and growth. And every day, they continued to build something that was in fact theirs alone. On the gallery's opening anniversary, Nick organized a special surprise for Lily. He had invited some of her favorite artists to an exclusive exhibition. And at the end of the event, he called her to the center of the gallery, where he made a brief statement. "Today, we celebrate another year of our gallery, of our home. Lily, everything we have here was built thanks to your strength, your passion, and your ability to see the beauty in even the darkest parts of life. I am forever grateful for every day we spent together, for every moment that inspires me to be a better person." Lily, emotional, couldn't contain her tears. At that moment, I knew that everything they had faced was necessary to get there. She looked around, seeing the people who had become part of their lives, the space they had created, and the future they now saw so clearly. That night, as they closed the gallery after the event, Nick and Lily walked through the silent rooms, the work still hanging on the walls, but the space already empty of visitors. She took his hand and pulled him to the center of the room, where, amid the stillness of the gallery, they danced in silence, just the two of them, enjoying the feeling of peace they had finally achieved. Little by little, the past became a distant memory, a closed chapter that now added to their story without the power to control them. They were, in fact, free to build their own narrative, a story that was made of love, strength, and above all, overcoming. On a sunny autumn morning, Nick and Lily walked side by side through the streets of New York, the city that had become the symbol of their new beginning. Golden leaves covered the sidewalks, and the cold air felt invigorating, as if the world was offering them a new beginning, a blank page. After everything they had been through, each step felt like a testament to their journey. There they were, no longer as boss and employee, but as partners, each carrying their scars, but now with the lightness of someone who had finally left the past behind. They had left the gallery in the hands of a trusted friend, deciding that they needed to give themselves time to live, travel, breathe. Nick, previously so caught up in the idea of control, now wanted to explore the world alongside Lily, free from immediate commitments and the pain that previously defined them. This trip to New York was part of this desire for renewal, and the two walked through the streets as if every corner held new discoveries, new reasons to laugh, to smile, to celebrate what they had. Lily observed everything around her with curious eyes, absorbing every detail of the city with an intensity that enchanted Nick. "It's amazing to be here without any weight," she commented, looking at him with a calm smile. "Who would have thought that we would be together in New York, just the two of us, with nothing holding us back?" He chuckled, tucking a strand of her hair behind her ear. "It's funny to think about it, isn't it? A while ago, I wouldn't have even considered this possibility, always so caught up in my obligations, in memories of the past. But now everything feels so right, so free." They decided to stop at a charming cafe that they had found by chance. The place was cozy, with classic decor, dark wooden tables and large windows that let in sunlight, reflecting a soft glow inside the place. It was an environment that conveyed tranquility, and where the two felt comfortable talking and sharing thoughts and dreams. As they settled down at a table near the window, they looked at each other, and Nick held Lily's hand affectionately, intertwining their fingers as if that gesture was a silent confirmation of the bond they had built. "Lily," he began, looking into her eyes, "have you ever stopped to think about everything we've been through so far? Everything we faced, the wounds, the scars, and now we are here, ready to start again." She smiled, an expression of joy and serenity on her face. "It's true, Nick. I never imagined that our story would bring us here, to this moment of peace, where everything finally seems to make sense. I think that, deep down, each of us had to go through what we went through to be able to be here, together." The two ordered coffee and lost themselves in a light but meaningful conversation. They talked about what they most wanted to accomplish together, their dreams, and the future they now seemed willing to build. For the first time, they spoke about their plans without fear, without the weight of doubts or uncertainty that previously surrounded them. Nick, who previously believed that his destiny was tied to a life of rules and responsibilities, now allowed himself to dream of traveling more, seeing the world, exploring new horizons alongside Lily. "I want our life to be like this," he said, in a loving tone, full of discoveries, of simple and real moments like this. He watched her, noticing the serene happiness on her face. "I want every day by your side to be a new chance to see the world with new eyes." Lily laughed, feeling her heart beat faster when she heard his words. "Me too, Nick. I want to live by your side, without the weight of expectations or fears. I want our story to be ours alone, free from whatever the past is left." At that moment, the coffees arrived and they toasted, laughing at the simplicity of that moment, but feeling that it was perhaps one of the most important of their lives. Sipping her coffee, Lily looked out the window and saw a group of children playing in the park across the street. Their laughter echoed in the air, and the sight reminded her of how deep down she had always wanted a full life. A family, something that was simple and true. Nick, noticing Lily's distant gaze, asked softly, "What are you thinking about?" She looked at him, her face lit up with a smile. "How incredible it would be to build a family one day, something of our own, something that is like a continuation of this happiness we found together." He watched her for a moment, taking in her words, and felt a wave of happiness wash over him. He had always imagined himself alone, but with Lily by his side, the idea of forming a family, of sharing a real life, now seemed more possible, and in fact, more desired. Nick walked over, taking her hand and stroking it affectionately. "I think that too, Lily," he confessed, his voice soft but full of emotion. "I want all of this by your side. I want a future where we can teach what we learn, where we can create our own memories, without any ghosts or shadows. I want our children to know that love and forgiveness are the most powerful things we can offer." She smiled, moved by his words, feeling like this was the moment everything finally made sense. It was as if all the pain, the struggles, the doubts they had faced had prepared them for something bigger, something they could build with the certainty that they were ready. She took his face in her hands and kissed him, a kiss full of promise, love, and a silent commitment to the future. Later, after leaving the cafe, they continued walking through the streets of New York, exploring every corner of the city as if it were the first time they were there. The two were like tourists rediscovering the world, next to each other, laughing, sharing stories, and dreaming about everything the future had in store for them. The freedom they felt, the certainty that they were finally free to be who they were, was an emotion that strengthened them at every step. That night, back at the hotel, as they watched the city lights from the window, Nick and Lily made one last promise. They promised that they would never let the shadows of the past intrude again, that they would always support each other, no matter what life brought. They were ready to start a new story, one that didn't need explanations or excuses. They hugged each other, feeling the warmth and strength of their love, and finally let the past become just a distant memory. There, under the lights of New York, Nick and Lily were ready to live life to its fullest, together, writing a story that, this time, was entirely theirs.